starting the first of a series, the first workshop of 5 workshops that we will have every Thursday. And we are here organizing with Julian Chase and with Agustin Redondo and Hildegard. Julian Chase, perhaps I give you 1 minute, 2 minutes to introduce yourself. And then after I will say the same with Agustin. I'm not sure if Hildegard is, oh yeah, Hildegard is here. So she can perhaps also introduce herself. The idea of this work started almost 2.5 years ago when we had also a meeting in The Hague regarding tax, trade, and investment. And we see that every time there is more links towards what does it mean, the models of governance from tax, for investment, for trade, but also in terms of dispute resolution, domestic provisions, and so forth. So we decided to make this workshop today online, and then we will have 4, as I mentioned, 4 workshops, and then a final workshop where we have a policymaker. All workshops are available for everyone, so it's free of registration. And today we will start with me organizing the first part and the importance of domestic law for the interpretation of tax, trade, and investment treaties. And perhaps, Julian, should I give you 2 minutes just to introduce yourself as one of the co-organizers?
Thank you, Emma. So I'd like to say a good evening to everyone from Hong Kong. So I'm a professor of law at the City University of Hong Kong for now many years. I'm delighted to work with Irma and Augustin on this project. I mostly come from investment arbitration and trade law. But we began to discuss with Irma, I think, even more than 2 years ago, in terms of the growing interactions between trade, tax, and investments. And so it was quite natural to join our forces to put together this series of webinars. And I will chair the 3rd seminar on June 17, which will focus on dispute resolution and how investment arbitration is dealing with tax matters, how WTO is also handling these similar questions, as well as the role of the United Nations Court of Justice, and the last but not the least, the European Court of Justice in tax dispute resolution. So I wish you all a great seminar today and a great series for the weeks to come.
Thank you, and I will give the word now to Agustin, perhaps.
Yes, thanks, Irma. Yes, I'm here. We have been working together with Irma for a long while. My focus, or the focus of CEP, the Council on Economic Policy's fiscal policy program, is on tax expenditures, tax incentives. And there's certainly a big role that these provisions play in the context of attracting investment and international trade. As Julian, I will be leading the session on June 24th, so in a few weeks now, that will be focusing on tax incentives for investment, old and new challenges for international trade. We have a great lineup, I think, with Hania Cronford for the World Bank, Pascual Pistone from IBFD, Simon Evenet from St. Gallen University, Alexandra Redhead, who's working for IISD, and Liz Johnson, who works for the Columbia Center of Sustainable Investment. So yeah, if you can make it, we would be glad to have you joining us.
Thank you so much, Agustin. And then we have, last but definitely not least, because it's the next one, the next week, she will be the convener. Hildegard, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm Hildegard, and I'm also at CEP with Agustin. I started there only January this year. And before that, I worked at the OECD on international trade and services. And my seminar next week will be on digital services taxes, which is really exciting these days. You have these negotiations under BEPS at the OECD, and we expect at least some progress in July this year. And we saw yesterday that the US is imposing tariffs on a number of countries because they have introduced digital services taxes. So it's really a discussion at the very right time. And we have also a nice lineup with David Bradbury of the OECD and Wei Chui of the University of British Columbia, Wei Sang, who works at a law firm in Geneva, and she actually advises WTO delegations and government in this particular issue. And then we have Matthias Bauer of the ESIP in Brussels, and he's written a lot on digital services taxes as well. So I hope you will make it for the next session as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hildegard. And just to make sure, all sessions will be also recorded. So we will also make available the sessions for everyone. So, and the final session, that is the session 5, will take place on the 1st of July. And then also we have Marion Johnson from the OECD, the Director of Trade and Agriculture, Howard Mann, who is also here, Howard, the expert in international law and arbitration, Michael Leonard from the UN, and Patrick Lowe from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and Corey Hiller from the IMF. So I think that we are ready to start. The idea, as I mentioned today, we are going to have kind of a start with the theoretical. That this is a theory, but it's also what it brought us together. And I have been working with some of the speakers of today when we address issues such as, for instance, dispute resolutions, the issue of the most favored nation clause, the issue of national treatment. So we will start first with, in this order that we have in the program, and that will mean that we will start with first the trade implications in trade and investment treaties with Pedro Schwery. Then after we will go a little more towards investment with Wolfgang. And then after we are talking about dispute resolution, first with Anna Marholt from the University of Leiden, and then thereafter on investment dispute resolution with Paola Baldini from Leiden. And thereafter we will have two kind of cases of examples when we also look at the interaction between international law and AU law, and also the domestic provisions. So then we will have the proportionality review of fiscal measures from an international law and comparative perspective. That will be by Tony Marsal from University of Glasgow and Ricardo Garcia-Anton from Tilburg. And the final presentation will be the interplay between investment tax and dispute in AU law, and that will be Javier Garcia Olmedo, who is at this moment teaching, but he will join us later. So Pedro, I would say we will have, normally in our program, we have approximately 15 minutes for presentation, then we have 10 minutes for discussion. After, we will have also a break, and then we continue with the other presentations. We have 3 hours, but I think that there is enough material for the 3 hours, but we will also try to take it a little with all the questions and participation. So also please feel to introduce yourself in the chat, and please feel free to also have the discussion in the chat. And if you have questions directed towards one of the speakers or directed to everyone, should be an interactive, lively discussion. So Pedro Schwery is a tax lawyer. He's from Brazil, but how he is working now in PricewaterhouseCoopers. He just moved to the Netherlands, but he wrote an amazing book that we first started talking about BEPS and multilateral. And one of a sudden you got the book that it was completely comprehensive in terms of trade, investment, and tax. So Pedro, please, your time starts now. Thank you so much.
So yeah, my mission here today is to establish the relationship between the domestic tax provisions and how they can be impacted by trade and investment treaties. And I decided to do it in a little bit of a different way. Instead of doing it abstractly, I decided to bring 2 cases: the Argentina Financial Services, which has a great interaction between the GATS and tax measures, and then the Mikula case. And by doing that, I want to illustrate how bilateral investment treaties and the GATS have a very clear impact on tax measures, and then also introduce what are the challenges that we face when we try to make this interaction. And here I'm putting the keyword fragmented frameworks. But yeah, we'll get there. So first, when we go to Argentina financial services, and please interrupt me at any point if you want to discuss something. The background of Argentina Financial Services is the development of exchange of information in the global forum. This was quite exciting for us in the tax world, but it really came to life because of the backing of the G20. They endorsed the exchange of information initiative, but more than endorsing, they even issued a statement saying, well, for the countries who are non-cooperative, we're gonna create a toolbox of measures that are meant to be defensive measures to incentivize countries to comply or to punish the non-compliance. And these measures were of a tax nature, but also of a financial nature, loans and investment aid and so on. But in the tax field, it was mentioned high withholding taxes on certain payments or denial of deductibility targeting these jurisdictions. And you can argue if this is a discriminatory measure or not, but I find it very interesting to see in a different context how the European Commission described these measures. They're meant to make it less attractive for companies to do business or invest in these jurisdictions. So defensive measures, they carry inherently this discriminatory aspect. And well, this is exactly what came to happen in Argentina financial services. So in line with these developments, Argentina developed a list of non-cooperative jurisdictions, jurisdictions with whom they didn't exchange information and there was no negotiations to that end, and Panama was included. And if you're a listed jurisdiction, what Argentina would do, they would have, among other measures, I picked one up here, they would have an irrebuttable presumption that the loan repayments would represent a net gain of 100%. And if you were in a different jurisdiction, for instance, this presumption would be of a net gain of 43%. So if you are a financial services provider from Argentina, from Panama, you are much worse off. And that's why then Panama decided to challenge this on the basis of the GATS national treatment and most favored nation obligations. And I'm not going to enter into how this can be. There are a list of exemptions from most favored nation or commitments in national treatment, but in this case, this was in place, so they could make this challenge. Well, what the national treatment obligation says, for instance, is that you cannot afford a less favorable treatment to a like service from the other jurisdiction, and the analysis is then broken down into what is the likeness of the services and what is the less favorable treatment. And I don't want to go too much into the likeness here. Could it be that the services were actually different and therefore not comparable, and you don't have this analysis? Well, you could argue that the regulatory framework in Panama is so different that the services are actually different as well. The panel thought that, well, no, actually the services are comparable, and the appellate body reversed this. I don't want to get too much into that. What is interesting as a tax practitioner is to look at the no less favorable treatment idea. So the panel made an analysis, and I'm putting my words here, but they actually looked into what is leveling the playing field. They said, well, the defensive measures could be seen as discriminatory, but because they're actually trying to compensate this regulatory advantage, then they're actually promoting a level playing field. And in this sense, there was no less favorable treatment here. And the appellate body says, wait a minute, this is not what we look at in WTO law. There is no leveling the playing field justification, and therefore we cannot accept that there was no less favorable treatment here. In the end, the appellate body did not issue a decision whether or not this was a discrimination, but from a tax perspective, it was very interesting to see first this interaction with the global forum standards, and an evaluation of what is accepted or not in terms of the ideas that we have in tax. And my provocation here is, well, we could very well in tax try to plug our ideas into what are the WTO ideas and say, well, there are exceptions that are not leveling the playing field, but you can look at whether or not a measure is necessary to secure compliance with laws and regulations. this would be an exception, or if the measure is aimed at ensuring equitable or effective imposition of direct taxes. So all this could make our interaction between the tax world and the trade and investment world more smooth, and I would call it then a type of institutional dialogue. And now I'll change worlds a little bit and go to the bilateral investment treaties. This case, Mikula, is so interesting. So what happened here is that the Swedish investors made an investment in Romania, and as a part of their investment, they were relying on some tax incentives for a less developed region. And because of Romania's later accession to the EU, Romania had to withdraw these tax incentives before the appropriate time. And the investors were then challenging whether this was in breach of the fair and equitable treatment clause. And this is a very general clause that protects investors against arbitrariness, ensures due process, good faith, and so on. And here we were looking at whether or not the investor had a legitimate expectation that these incentives would be in place for longer. And this was actually a very factual analysis made by the arbitral body. And eventually they found that yes, because of the facts and how the investors came into making the investment, they had a legitimate and reasonable expectation that the incentives would be there for longer. So you see here an interaction between tax incentives and fair and equitable treatment. I just brought another parenthesis here. This clause can be seen in different ways in a different case. The erratic behavior of the tax authorities regarding VAT credits and refunds was found to be in breach of fair and equitable treatment. Or if you have a more severe case, one taxpayer is being harassed and abused by the tax authorities, this could actually amount to expropriation. That was UCOS. So this is the kind of interaction that we can see here. But moving on to the Mikula case, what was really interesting was that Romania had to withdraw these incentives because otherwise they would have been state aid. And by granting the arbitral award, the Commission was of the view that you're reinstating the state aid, and that would actually need to be recovered as well. And the General Court later said no, because these events preceded the accession to the EU, so in this case not. But actually, if you have an European member state with a bilateral investment treaty with a third country, you could imagine that this issue comes back to light. And you can imagine, for instance, that you have a taxpayer who has an APA, an advanced pricing agreement with the tax authority. Everybody's happy. There is stability in the relationship, and all of a sudden, the Commission comes and says, well, actually, this is state aid. This APA that you were relying on is not valid, so I will recover it. Well, would this be in breach of the fair and equitable treatment? Yes or no? This idea is not mine. It's Stone, I think, wrote it somewhere. But this issue could be concretely happening, and could you rely then on dialogue to solve this? Here I'm a bit more skeptical. Maybe here we really have a conflict between the frameworks. You're going to have to choose one or the other. You cannot try to harmonize them so much. Anyway, what I try to do here then, just to sum up, is I would try to make the point that there is a strong connection between trade and investment treaties and domestic tax provisions. You're essentially looking at the non-discrimination clauses and fair and equitable treatment and expropriations, and I didn't even touch on subsidy and transfer of capital provisions. And from the domestic tax side, you can think of tax incentives could be an issue, and then other measures that are targeting certain jurisdictions, so withholding taxes, deductibility rules, aggressive transfer pricing practices, even CFC rules, depending on their design. So this was the point. And then the challenge is how do we deal with this interaction if we have such a different design and sometimes different policies and different objectives? Anyway, I hope I was within my time, Irma. And yep, that's it.
You were even 5 minutes early, but it's also good. Thanks so much, Pedro. We have now 10 minutes for clarification questions for discussion. If someone else have a really question that says, I want to ask, please raise your hand. You can also raise it here, or if you can have a discussion in the chat. I do not see right now someone having a question, but is anyone having a question right now? No? Because actually what we could do is perhaps do also—
I can have the question, Irma, if you want.
Yes, please. Go ahead. I didn't see your hand, and now I see Ricardo and Julian. Okay, then it's great.
Okay.
The hand works.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for a very nice presentation and setting the scene. So you were a bit reluctant of with judicial dialogue, no? How to solve cases like Mikula, like presented, no? So why are you so reluctant, or what do you think would be? You didn't step in. You just said setting the scene, but trying to provoke how to try to solve, in, for instance, European space, this kind of conflict. How will be? Why are you so reluctant to the judicial dialogue? No, that will be my question.
Yeah, and I say, Pedro, if you don't mind, we do 2 questions, and then Ricardo and Julian, and then you can reply. Is that good?
Sounds good.
Julian, please.
Thank you, Emma. Look, I'll focus on the WTO. I understand from your presentation that tax transparency was at the center of this Argentina-Panama dispute, right? So the first quick question I have is, what does this case, including both the panel report and the appellate body report, tell us as for what domestic measures WTO members can enact to address tax transparency issues? And a quick follow-up, which would be to simply ask you, with that decision, and in particular the appellate body report, does it mean that defensive tax measures are never inconsistent by themselves as such, and that all depend on the implementation of such measures? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please, Pedro, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I think the first one from Ricardo, I'm actually quite enthusiastic about the idea of judicial dialogue. And when you think of a handful of cases in Argentina, financial services is one of them. You could really see a lot of improvement from judicial dialogue or institutional dialogue in that case. So if you would have the justification of our defensive measures, not in terms of trying to level the playing field, that is like a tax lingo, but if you actually would go to the hard law, WTO is hard law. So if we would respect that and try to plug our policy implementation in connection or in dialogue with WTO law, that would make potentially the panel and the appellate bodies' life much easier in trying to understand why do we think that this is justifiable, or, you know, at least from the perspective of the policymaker. And then in the Mikula case, I was being skeptical just because, you know, here it seems that the objectives are frontally different. So one policy is to say, well, there is a tax incentive here that I want to protect, and the other is saying, well, I don't want tax incentives at all. You know, I have a hard time trying to make them read a certain standard the same way, is just because the standards are going in a different direction. So that was the reason for my skepticism, but I'm quite enthusiastic about the idea of judicial dialogue, and I think we can solve a lot of our problems with that. And if that's okay, Ricardo, or if you want to follow up, let me know. But if I move on then to Julian's question, so here we were talking about what's the tax transparency implications, and, you know, are defensive measures always justified or always not justified? It's difficult to say because the appellate body didn't give us a material to, you know, like say that it's always going to be this way or that way. But my take on it is, if we want to justify defensive measures, we have to think a bit differently. We cannot try to justify them on the basis of leveling the playing field or the way we're used to in tax, or we don't even think we need to justify them sometimes. We do need to justify them. And if you think of tax transparency in terms of this is important to make sure that we're compliant with the laws and regulations of a certain country, well, this is exactly what tax transparency is trying to do. So why don't we plug that into the WTO exception, and that could make it easier to try and justify a defensive measure. So this is where I was going, but for tax transparency, because there is that potential plug with compliance with the laws and regulations, I think the justification could be possible. It depends a bit on the design. But I was studying in my PhD BEP Section 5, and if you design an IP box that is not compliant with BEP Section 5, then you could be open to defensive measures. Well, here you're no longer talking about tax transparency, about something that is essential to compliance with laws and regulations. You're talking about something that's more, a policy choice, even, if you will. So here I would be more skeptical that you can actually use defensive measures. So this is where I was going. I don't know if it answers you, Julian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pedro. I have another question from Scott Wilkie. Please go ahead, Scott.
Hi, Pedro. It's good to see you, and thank you for that. As you know, it's a very interesting subject for me. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about whether and to what extent you think that simply the systemic characteristics of a tax system in themselves may be fairly considered to be discriminatory in the sense contemplated, for example, by the WTO agreements or the state aid provisions in the TFE EU. I mean, I'm thinking not only of that debate which is going on in the European General Court and the ECJ at the moment, originally spawned by cases in Spain and Belgium, but I'm also thinking as well in the context of what for me is a very confused and not particularly rigorous examination underlying the BEPS and the Pillars discussions orchestrated by the OECD about whether and to what extent support and assistance, which is insidiously conveyed by countries through, for example, their CFC rules and in other ways, because the CFC rules that are territorial are essentially tax-sparing provisions in a different way. To what extent you think that simply the systemic characteristics of tax systems that we've taken for granted are at risk in this kind of an analysis, or at risk is judging. I don't mean to judge it. I think that that light is shone on them for what they may be.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. It's good to see you. And I think this is exactly the type of question that we need to raise now, because this is all in motion. And so when you raised the question, my immediate thought was to go back to the Foreign Sales Corporation case by the US. And then they kind of tried to accuse the European countries, the territorial countries, of doing the same and actually having a subsidy embedded in the territorial system. And if I'm not mistaken, initially they decided that yes, this was I think it was I don't remember if it was a subsidy or a discriminatory treatment. I think it was a subsidy. But then afterwards, there was a compromise reached, and territorial systems were regarded as normal, because that's the regular framework. That's the inherent characteristic of that system, and this was then endorsed under WTO law, whereas the US side was not. They were really having kind of like an export incentive embedded into their normal framework that was worldwide taxation. So and for me, this seems to be right. If you have a consistent framework that is always applicable in the same way, I don't tax foreign income because in my framework, this is out of my jurisdiction to tax. That's fine. But when we talk about, you know, I will have a top-up tax only if the other country taxed at a lower rate. Well, now you're targeting certain jurisdictions. You're just trying to do that in a more systemic way, but you know, you're still only applying this top-up tax to you know, A, B, and C, and that seems to carry a more discriminatory element inside of it, and I'm also uncomfortable with that.
And one of the issues, if I can say that I mean, again, it seems to be plaguing the European jurisprudence at the moment, and Professor Ruth Mason at Virginia has written a little bit about this too, is whether or not, and I'm raising this because you just mentioned something that I think is important, is the standard by which a country's systemic tax characteristics to be judged the internal standard of that country, or is it some more exogenous standard that somehow or other takes into account the perceptions of other countries, which is essentially what the issue is in the state aid cases that are transfer pricing based in Europe. And I think Professor Mason's view would be, well, if it's an exogenous standard, then there is no standard, because so it has to be somehow or other judged within the country's tax system. But then as you go back to the FSC case, which I think is an important you know, frame of reference, it's essentially the FSC case that's being relitigated in Europe right now with respect to the Spanish cases and the Belgian excess profits and Starbucks and other cases, which is to say, you know, yes, these are kind of oblique features of the internal features of the tax system. They don't target particular persons, they don't target particular sectors, they don't target particular industries, but they provide necessarily a subsidy to the extent that the underlying profits of subsidiaries, for example, simply aren't taxed. They even raise, you know, the sort of freedom of establishment kind of notions, I think, in Europe. And so essentially what the tax system does is put in play all of these underlying notions which were developed in a much more innocent time, it seems to me. I'll stop. I won't say any more.
Thank you so much, Scott. Pedro, 1 minute to react. Besides the fact that it's already too complex, how we are doing, and that's the reason why we are having these discussions, what I found really interesting. Pedro?
Yeah, no, all of what Scott is saying resonates, and what is interesting in that what I like in this discussion is really, do you have an external standard that everybody has to comply with, or you know, each country decides its own standard? And to my knowledge, we didn't agree on anything internationally that has to be followed by everyone. We have, you know, the transfer pricing guidelines, but they're guidelines, they're not any agreement or anything like that. So anyway, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much.
But you know, this is amazing. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that in the following also this conference, this series of workshops, we have also a special issue that some of you will be contributing, and also the relationship between what is meaning now with this tax and what are the standards, and just what you mentioned, I mean, transfer pricing guidelines, but did the BEPS project change and the minimum standard change that from guidelines, from soft law to hard law? So that's one of the questions to keep in mind, but of course, is at the first presentation, so we have many to go. I will give now the word to Wolfgang. Wolfgang, you also mentioned in the chat a very interesting saying that I think in the GATT, if there is compliance with laws and regulations, mainly it means domestic law, but perhaps now it should also mean international law. So, and this is quite interesting, so it's in the chat for you to read and perhaps to discuss on that. But Wolfgang, I will give you the word to you. I know that you have been working on tax and investment. I know that you have already written on the topic of whether the relationship, but also the models of governance between the two areas. So please, Wolfgang, please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
Here we go. So thank you very much for inviting me and including me in this discussion. So I want to shift the focus a little bit. So Pedro really talked about the interaction between trade, tax, and investment at the dispute settlement level, where these different norms interact in relation to specific disputes. What I want to talk about is more the reform side and the negotiator side, how they view these different systems interacting. Because in fact, in all three systems, we have major international multilateral reforms ongoing. So what can we learn about this interaction, about these reform analogies? The main point that I want to make is that each of these regimes, and I'll focus primarily on the tax and the trade regime, and then I'll come back to the investment one. Each of these regimes, they have a certain frame, a certain view, a certain way of thinking about multilateralism. And each of these communities is relatively stuck in these views. So we don't usually think about how tax multilateralism might be applied to the trade regime or vice versa. What makes all this interesting is that in investment law, as I said, we have a major reform going on. And in the past, investment law reformers oriented their reform ideas and their analogies on the trade regime. But as I'll argue later on, what we are seeing now is a little bit like the movie Harry and Sally, that now investment has met tax. And what we see is that increasingly we are talking about tax rather than trade analogies as we are thinking about the reform of international investment law. So what I want to talk about is just a little bit about these reform analogies. Why do they matter? Second, I'll talk about the two competing visions of multilateralism in tax and trade. And then finally, I'll link this back to investment law reform. So framing, analogies, why do we care? Well, frames are really important because they determine, they're the conceptual windows that determine what we see, how we understand the world. They organize ideas, they determine what is good, what is bad, how we should make sense of the world. And by doing so, they guide our actions. So if we think that a certain thing is good, then we direct our actions towards enhancing more of it and mitigating negative aspects. So this is both an opportunity, but also a challenge because each frame obscures and highlights certain issues. So it's an opportunity because switching from frames, for instance, switching from the tax to the trade multilateralism framework entails some advantages because we see the world differently. But it's also a challenge because normally we don't do that. Tax practitioners are stuck in their tax frame, trade practitioners are stuck in their trade frame, and investment practitioners are stuck in their investment frame. But why does it nevertheless matter? Well, there's a wonderful book coming out by Anthea Roberts and Nicholas Lumb on the 6 phases of globalization, where they make the case that these narratives, these frameworks are really important. And one of the ways in which they highlight why this is important is with reference to this elephant graph that you might have seen about the change in real income in society. So some parts of the population have gained massively in the 20 years that is monitored here, and others have gained relatively little. That's the trove here, number 2. And if you then look at people like Trump, they have framed how we should make sense of that elephant graph by looking at the point between 1 and 2, that frame, where the people in the rich world, the blue-collar workers in the rich world, have lost out at the expense of the newly enriched people in the developing world, notably in China. And that's why nativism, trade wars are the policy consequences that flow from this type of frame. In contrast, Bernie Sanders thinks, well, it's not really China that has gained, it's the global 1% that has gained in those 20 years at the expense of blue-collar workers in the rich world. And that means what we really have to do is we have to reshift the tax base, we have to tax the rich and give more of that to the blue-collar workers who have lost out. And so these different frames lead to very different understandings of the world, and they lead to very different policy consequences. The argument that I'm trying to make today is that we should think about multilateralism and how the different regimes frame multilateralism in very similar ways. So how does trade and tax frame their approach to multilateralism? Well, here I think really 3 points that set these two frames apart. Trade is about stratified multilateralism, tax is about networked multilateralism. Trade is about centralization, tax is about decentralized multilateralism, and trade is about rigid architectures, while tax is about flexible architectures. What do I mean by that? Let me go through each of those. So what do I mean by stratified versus network? If you look at the architecture of the trade regime, it is stratified. It is layered in different components. We have the multilateral on top. That's the WTO. The WTO allows countries to engage in agreements with just a subset of the members. Those are the plurilateral agreements. And in addition, countries can also engage in bilateral treaties, bilateral free trade agreements, but that nevertheless have to meet, that have to comply with the WTO framework. So there's a certain hierarchy there. There's these layers, and consequences flow from these layering. One of the consequences is that the multilateral rules that are agreed on at the WTO, they usually percolate downwards. So if we look at the free trade agreements that are signed at the bottom, they often copy and they reproduce many of the rules that are already in the WTO. At the same time, from bottom to top, there is very little interaction. So we have new rules in almost every free trade agreements that have been recently concluded on electronic commerce, but we don't have multilateral rules on electronic commerce. And it's very difficult for these electronic commerce rules to make their way up through the stratified universe. The tax architecture is very different. Here we have a network system. That is because the multilateral elements, notably the MLI, the instrument that has been created through the BEPS framework, is chained by bilateral investment treaties directly. We have multilateral tax rules. We have multilateral tax rules that change the content of bilateral tax rules. And so the multilateral and the bilateral and the plurilateral, they are all part of the same network. One of the advantages is then that whatever happens at the multilateral, like through the MLI, diffuses directly to those bilateral tax treaties that are governed. And so while the trade framework creates a lot of resilience, because basically these are distinct layers and each of these layers copies from the other, it is very different at the tax regime where it is just one big network. But the advantage of that big network is that ideas flow more easily between the multilateral and the bilateral, which is why tax treaties today have been updated with this multilateral BEPS convention, while in the trade regime, we have very much outdated multilateral rules, and most of the innovation is happening at the bilateral, not the multilateral level. What about the centralization? So here in the tax regime, let's start here, we have a decentralized architecture and diffuse hierarchies. There's not an international tax organization that makes all the rules. The OECD, of course, is a focal point here, but it is part of an architecture where different sources of authority come together. And it is based on these bilateral agreements where most of the rulemaking is taking place. So the OECD really only plays a coordinating role. This is very different as we compare it to the trade regime, which is very centralized. It's the WTO that not only acts as a focal point, but that also acts as the rulemaking hub, at least traditionally, where most of the important decisions are taking place. In addition, that's also where all the dispute settlement is taking place. Actually, very little dispute settlement is taking place under these decentralized free trade agreements. Most states don't bring their claims under these free trade agreements, they bring them at the WTO. So we have centralization here, but dispute settlement and tax is completely decentralized. It takes place under these bilateral tax treaties, either through diplomatic means or through tax arbitration. What are some of the consequences from this? Well, there is less consistency in the tax regime because we have multiple points of authority, but it also allows for more experimentation. In the trade regime, we have more consistency because we have the central its rules, but also where most of the disputes are happening. But that also means that there's less experimentation. Now let's go to the third and final point of comparison here between these two regimes. And I hope you're still with me. Yeah, my connection is a bit stable. That is between rigid rules in the WTO and more flexible ones in the tax regime. So if you look at how rulemaking works at the WTO, it is really about this big, what I call big bang rulemaking. So nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That means there's a lot of negotiation leading up to these big packages. That's why as trade lawyers, we often refer back to the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round, or unfortunately, the Doha round that did not result in this big bang rulemaking effort. But it's really about lots of negotiations leading up to this major change. In tax, it is more about a gradual rulemaking, which has to do with the fact that we have a model tax treaty at the OECD that is continuously updated and that then serves as focal point for states to update their bilateral agreements. At the WTO, it's also very much one size fits all, because as you accede to the WTO, you have to abide by all the rules. As those who have studied the tax regime know, there's a lot of flexibility, even in the multilateral aspects. The MLI provides lots of flexibility to choose different menu options from the same buckets of rules. Of course, there are minimum standards, but those are relatively self-contained. Lots of other aspects, such as arbitration, is opt-in, other rules are opt-out. So there's a lot of a la carte rulemaking that is going on at the tax regime that then creates lots of flexibility. Also, I'd say that formal rulemaking plays a much bigger role in trade multilateralism than it plays in tax multilateralism. Because at the WTO, we have the spirit of these negotiations that lead to new hard laws. A lot of effort is being put into these negotiations. While in the committees and at the WTO, there's also formal exchanges going on. It is much less high profile, it's much less important than those big bang rulemaking efforts. In the tax regime, we see this interesting percolation where informal rules, soft law, later becomes hard law, where soft law instruments, such as the Model Convention, play a very important role in shaping hard law, even if it never becomes hard law. And so informal rulemaking plays a much more important role in the tax regime. So why does that matter then? Well, it matters amongst others as we think about reforming international investment law, because we have thousands of international investment treaties that are currently being reformed at the multilateral level, at least in relation to dispute settlement, through the UNCITRAL Working Group 3 effort. And so, as I've hinted before, for most investment lawyers, the focal point, the reference point, has always been the trade regime. We have a multilateral agreement on investments that was negotiated in the 1990s, where tax lawyers, investment lawyers, were trying to replicate a little bit of that big bang multilateralism that had just succeeded at the WTO by creating this multilateral investment agreement that had centralized dispute settlement, that had centralized rules, and that would have become hard law. Similarly, many of the efforts that are currently ongoing to reform international investment law, I think, are also inspired by this framework of trade multilateralism, because the European Union in particular is very keen to create a multilateral investment court or multilateral investment tribunal, or at least some kind of appeal instance, which is similar to what we know from the WTO appellate body, in order to create some of this consistency that we know from international trade law. So the trade analogies have been very prominent in international investment law and in the reform efforts that have been ongoing. Through events like this, however, and through collective thinking more generally, I think this is beginning to change. I think that investment lawyers increasingly look to tax rather than trade in order to rethink how the investment law system should work. And to me, this makes perfect sense. Investment law is quite similar to tax law. We have a decentralized architectures of thousands of investment and tax treaties. Similar views in relation to what is being regulated. Investment and tax treaties are about helping investors either to not be taxed twice or to recover some of the losses from undue governmental interventions. So these two fields are actually much more similar. It's almost like you're finally falling in love with your best friend who's much more similar than you are, than this popular guy that you've met and that you always aspired to marry. The trade regime, while in fact the tax regime, your best buddy, has always been there and is a much better match for you. And so how does that materialize itself specifically? Well, we have more talk about creating a flexible framework in international investment law, an MLI-inspired multilateral convention that would then reform without abolishing or without replacing bilateral investment agreements. We have talked about more informal rulemaking, more decentralized rulemaking, perhaps soft law instruments, soft law codes of conduct, and in general, a more decentralized architecture. So to summarize, I think investment law, in terms of the analogies that are present, is really shifting from trade to tax. And I'm doing some of this analysis as part of a forthcoming book on investment arbitration and state-driven reform. But this is really early thinking, so I'm really looking forward to your input and to your suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. I have to say, perfect on time. So thank you. Let's see who would like to ask a question. Because actually I have one, but I thought, well, I give opportunity. Wolfgang, one of the things, I think that Julian wants to ask a question, and Frederick, so I will give them and I will ask later on. Julian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Emma, for allowing me to start. So I like the way Wolfgang compared trade and tax multilateralisms, and I'll focus on this question. I just wonder whether you would agree on a fourth criterion, which I think is the question of information and data, and more generally, the issue of how to collect, analyze, and disseminate information. In fact, I thought about this, seeing Pedro's answer to your earlier question in the chat box. My idea is that in the tax world, multilateral organizations, UN, OECD, have had the role to disseminate information and shared practices. That's the role they've had for many, many years. And so it's essential that they had this role in order to put together draft conventions, which were then left to bilateral negotiations. If you look at the WTO, the way WTO has dealt with information is very different. WTO has worked in a different way to organize dispute management or manage rounds of very difficult negotiations in which the information was not always fully circulating among the members. And that's been, I mean, one of the many criticisms expressed by a number of countries and coalitions. So yeah, would you agree with this idea that the two multilateralisms are also different when it comes to the access and the management of information with the tax or trade information?
Yeah, and I will give the word now to Frederick, 2 questions, and then Wolfgang will react. Please, Frederick.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. And my question would be whether or what makes you think that the way that it works on tax is actually the desirable way. What I think is that in many discussions that in tax, the idea of a multilateral convention of solving things more in a multilateral way is quite prominent for several reasons. One is that the process, this bilateral process, may actually be not that effective as solving problems that are perceived as problems. For example, the MLI, while it has amended many treaties, it may not always have amended the most important or most problematic treaties, and not necessarily in the way that that countries wanted it to be. And this raises some questions about whether this is actually the way that that things should go.
Thank you, Frederick. Wolfgang, I give you the word.
Actually, my internet cut out. We have a bit of a rainstorm here, so that's why it may be unstable. So I caught Julien's, but not Frederick's point. I don't know whether you just want to repeat it quickly or.
Frederick, if you could repeat it.
Sure,
yes,
no
please.
problem, no problem. So my question would be, what would make you think that going in the way that the tax regime does it is actually the desirable way? Background is that in many discussions on tax or among the tax community, there's often still calls for multilateral, like more binding rules or more truly multilateral rulemaking, and maybe there's also some evidence that the way this works is not currently is not that effective at solving problems that are perceived as problems. For example, the MLI might not really affect those treaties which are the most relevant or the most problematic, or like new innovations such as, for example, the UN tax committee, which produced a new article on how to tax digital services in a tax convention. The way it works right now, it's unlikely that will ever find its way into those treaties where it would be relevant, so where there is significant digital service trend. So it's quite a conservative instrument or way of doing as well.
Thank you, Frederick. Wolfgang?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there has been a slight omission on my part that I didn't necessarily want to say that one framework of thinking about multilateralism is necessarily better than the other. I think one may be more appropriate for the particular situation that investment law is in. So maybe in a perfect world, we would all strive for trade-hard multilateralism, but I think different international conditions give rise to different regime structures. And while the 1990s may have been conducive to WTO-style multilateralism, I think a lot of the achievements of the tax regime in past years showcase at least that in an era where most people think that multilateralism is dead, because there are few multilateral agreements, right, being signed across international law more generally, the area where multilateralism, even in a different form, is happening is tax. So that's nevertheless something that is interesting. So I think to cut a long story short is that, yes, they are not positive, negative. All these frameworks have different advantages and differences, but I do think there's a debate worth having what is perhaps more appropriate and feasible in the current architecture. Maybe it changes in the future. Now, I didn't catch the end of Julien's point, but I think he talked about the different roles of these organizations in information exchange. That's definitely a very interesting point, especially at the negotiation stage. I have to think about this a little bit more. At least the way that I see the WTO currently is, it also provides a forum for exchanging information, although it does a relatively poor job at it. As we know, for instance, the free trade agreement monitoring is not particularly well done at the WTO. And so I think it could be better to coordinate international efforts, but through the transparency mechanism, it nevertheless does play some kind of information coordination and dissemination role. But it's definitely something that is very intriguing and that I want to think about more. Maybe we can have a conversation about this. And I did lose access to the chat, so I don't know whether there are any questions on the chat.
No, there are no questions, but just one thing for you to think, you don't need to react on that, is also in terms of information, seeing whether the people who are dealing with investment treaties communicate with the people who are dealing with tax treaties. And that's one of the problems that you have. There is asymmetries of information. So I know that, for instance, countries of trade, of investment negotiators are using the BEPS multilateral instrument as an example, but at the same time, they have never been in contact with people from the Minister of Finance who are negotiating the tax treaties. So I have an example there, but I will finish here because we have the next presentation before the break. Ricardo, I will give you the word afterwards if you don't mind, but thank you. So I will have Anna Marholt. She is assistant professor at the University of Leiden, and we are discussing the part of trade and what is dispute resolution. Anna, please go ahead.
Yes, I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me. I always love being invited in Irma's projects. It's been super interesting. I've been learning a lot. Now actually that I see the order, I think actually maybe I should have been before Wolfgang's fantastic presentation, because I'm kind of going back to basics. So for everyone who's not in-depth knowledgeable about the WTO and WTO law and the dispute settlement system, that's where I come in. I think a lot of you actually are very knowledgeable, but I was asked to give a very general presentation as a bit of a teaser for the other workshops that are coming. That should not be a main problem. By the way, I really love the elephant graph that Wolfgang used. I always use that to show whoever I'm presenting to, what the problems are that we're struggling with, and it just illustrates it really well. So yeah. So what will I talk about? I will just very briefly go back to basics and talk about the main features of the WTO dispute settlement system for those who don't know. And then I will just talk about some of the advantages and the successes of the system, and then move on to some of the drawbacks of the system. My presentation is not very legalistic. It's more about food for thought. So if we think about systems that would combine, tax dispute settlement, for instance, what do we like? What don't we like? What would we like to include? What do we want to stay away from? Well, obviously, the World Trade Organization is an international organization based in Geneva. The Secretariat is in Geneva. And as Wolfgang already very nicely explained to us, it administers rules for international trade and is especially a platform for negotiations. Anything can be negotiated and nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. So basically in the area of trade, there is really a wide amount of agreements, and yeah, everything's open for negotiation. It's also very much a member-driven organization, and it has grown exponentially, I would say, since the establishment of the WTO in 1995. And at present, we are talking about 164 members. And perhaps this is also one of the issues that makes the WTO, results in the WTO finding itself in such a challenging position at present, in the sense that we are dealing with very varying membership, much more than before. And, it starts to take on United Nations type of numbers with regard to members, with very different members with very different economies and thoughts about how the rules should work. So that's really something that you see. Now, with regard to the dispute settlement system, it's famous for the fact that it's a two-tier system. So you have a panel stage where you have 3 panelists from a pool. And basically, those are kind of ad hoc panelists that are available from an enormous roster of panelists globally that you have to decide upon. And then between quotation marks, a standing appellate body, which normally has 7 members. Not right now, as is not a surprise to you, even for those that are actually not deeply into WTO law. The WTO appellate body is in an impasse, which I will of course talk about later. It is governed by the dispute settlement understanding, so it has actually quite clear rules. They're trying to renegotiate that, but I wonder whether that will ever lead to anything. But this is kind of, these are the basics of the dispute settlement system. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the advantages, or at least the successes of the system. Well, what have we talked about before? So Wolfgang already very nicely illustrated. It's multilateralism. It seems what everybody aspire to. And yes, for a long time, of course, the WTO dispute settlement system really was seen as the jewel in the crown of the World Trade Organization. Why? Well, first of all, it's a compulsory dispute settlement system. This means that unlike with, for instance, the International Court of Justice, if a member lodges a complaint against another member, it has to accept jurisdiction. The dispute settlement is compulsory. It is also exclusive. So while, for instance, Wolfgang, of course, said that you can have preferential trade agreement, etc., in essence, the WTO dispute settlement system is an exclusive system, and that means that any dispute that arises out of the agreements must be settled within the system. And it's a complaint-based system. Well, unlike, for instance, the European Commission, with regard to competition law cases, acts like a quasi-prosecutor to see whether member states are actually abiding by the law. In the WTO, this works differently. One of the reasons it being a member-driven organization and the fact that there is compulsory dispute settlement is already, quite a high level for an international organization like this. So it is a complaint-based system. The WTO Secretariat doesn't go proactively to see whether member states are complying with WTO rules. Now, another success of the system is that it really covers all the WTO agreements and a broad variety of measures. So anything that relates to trade and could be seen as a violation of any of the WTO agreements, be it subsidies, anti-dumping, etc., can be all brought to the WTO. And it is also for that reason that it's compulsory and it covers a broad variety of measures that it has been extremely actively used. So there have been more than 600 disputes brought to the WTO, which really is a lot, and one of the reasons that it's called the success story. Another good or effective feature generally from the WTO dispute settlement system is that both panel and appellate body recommendations really must be implemented immediately, or at least within a reasonable period of time. So there is a real type of follow-up. So if there is a dispute and you have to comply, you have to make sure that you really implement those recommendations. And there is a decent monitoring system of compliance with rulings by members. Also, and that has changed, I would say recently more, one of the features why it was so successful is that the system was very legal technical. It was a particular area of international law, quite a technical area that was considered maybe less political than, let's say, your disputes that go to the International Court of Justice, etc. So the fact that it was a technical branch of law seemed, or at least made it seem less politicized. And therefore, you could say it was successful, more successful than maybe other dispute settlement systems in international law. But of course, trade is very political, such as is tax and investment and everything else. And recent times have only demonstrated that. So these have been kind of the main features, I would say, that make the WTO dispute settlement system an attractive system. It's multilateral. It has been, a closed off kind of self-contained regime. It's been actively used. And yeah, if you compare it to other international courts and tribunals, yeah, I could say it has been a very successful system. But as we all know, times are changing, and there definitely have been changing recently. And so if we look at the drawbacks of the system, I really wanted to kind of split it up in two types of drawbacks. That is kind of to isolate the current crisis that we're witnessing within the WTO to kind of other issues that we might not quite like about the system or might want to see it to be different. So of course, the current crisis, most of you will know, I think everybody will know, currently the appellate body is in an impasse. It cannot hear appeals for the fact that all the terms of the appellate body members have run out, and the United States is blocking the appointment of new appellate body members. Why? Well, one of the reasons, of course, is that there is a rule that appointments of appellate body members should happen by consensus. I have this between question marks, because the question is the fact that you have to appoint appellate body members by consensus, is that really a problem of the system, or is that an external political problem? Can we, if we change the rules, let's say if we would have majority appointments, appointments by majority voting, would that necessarily solve everything? So these are kind of questions we should ask ourselves. Is consensus the problem, or is it an external political problem with the system? So the reality is now that panel reports, of course, appealed into the void. So, if a member doesn't like the outcome of a panel, and these days actually all cases are being appealed, it just appeals it into the void, and that's the end of it. You can wait forever until the appellate body perhaps starts functioning again one day. Now, there has been a lot written about the causes of the crisis. So what happened that, for instance, the United States doesn't like the way the appellate body works, and it can go all the way back to how China is treated in their eyes in the system. But one of the major criticisms is that it's very difficult for the appellate body to restrain itself. And it tends to go and revisit facts in the cases on appeal. So it kind of has the tendency to go back into the facts and make extremely lengthy and technical reports and always overrule or revisit everything the panel has written. So this is one of the things, so the functioning of the appellate body itself could be seen as problematic and something that has to be considered. Now, I want to kind of isolate this, but of course this kind of all plays into the other set of issues that might be seen as drawbacks of the system, which is, and I already kind of mentioned it when talking about the difficulty of the AB to restrain itself, that trade disputes tend to be technical and complex for sure by nature. So if you look at the Boeing cases or a lot of subsidies or anti-dumping cases, they are technical by nature and that's something you have to live with. But the reports tend to become extremely lengthy and technical. And I have to say that I do not know many lawyers except for those working on the case or an academic that really dives into the case that will read a case from A to Z. That's just the reality of it. You isolate those paragraphs that are relevant for the topic that you are investigating and that you're needing it for, and that's it. So that's definitely something we have to think about. Do we want you know, a system where we have such enormously technical reports that apart from a handful of people, they're very difficult to understand. Now, another feature of the system is, of course, that big industry plays a very big role. And what do I mean by that? It's a state-to-state dispute settlement system. And this means, of course, that big industry has to lobby the government and try to convince the government that their case, so the fact that they suffer from a particular measure is worth starting a very costly litigation for at the WTO. What that means is that it is therefore an imperfect enforcement of trade rules in the sense that smaller industries, such as small and medium enterprises, might not be successful in lobbying the government unless they kind of unite in enormous business associations. So the state has to have an interest in that litigation, yeah? The state has to see money in that case, or has to see that it's worth it. So that's another kind of important feature. So you could say that that is, you know, first of all, political, but also asymmetrical with regard to those that can benefit from the rules of the WTO. Also, the dispute settlement system is mainly used by the big players. So that's another criticism. So here you see that really the WTO system reflects the power asymmetries that we have in the world, because the main litigants are between the EU, the US, and China. Petros Mavroidis, together with Swedish economist Johannesson, has made a very interesting study about who uses litigation in the WTO and why. And that, you know, you always will see these three coming back. In practice, it also works like this, that although you have these three panelists that are appointed at the panel stage to decide on the dispute, everybody that's a little bit an insider in WTO law knows that there is an extremely large role for the Secretariat in drafting reports behind the scenes. Basically, the question is whether the panelists that are chosen for dispute, to sit on disputes, actually possess the technical knowledge and expertise for actually litigating these or to decide on these disputes successfully. So this is also something to kind of consider or think about. Do we want a system where there's a secretariat that basically behind the scenes does the drafting or does the decisions, or at least guides the panelists to where they should go? Then, and this is also well known, especially for trade economists, etc. So the ultimate kind of remedy when you want to retaliate, let's say you win a case, but you win a case against a huge country and you're a tiny country, and you can suspend concessions, which means that you can retaliate. This often doesn't really work for small countries. In the end, it ends up hurting their own economies. So this was, of course, the case in US gambling, etc. So these are kind of things to think about. So we cannot, obviously, it's a political system, maybe less political than, you know, certain human rights issues, etc. But remains political, and it always will reflect power asymmetries in the world and large versus small economies. So those are kind of the main points I wanted to highlight. I wanted to kind of say that, again, to reiterate, although I had also a lot of criticism, that Up until now, the WTO dispute settlement system was one of the most successful dispute settlement systems in public international law. And that is largely due to the technical nature and because of the compulsory dispute settlement. Now it is in a political crisis with a dysfunctional appellate body. And the question is whether changing the rules of procedure with regard to the appointment of appellate body members will really solve this issue, or whether the solution is purely political. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Anna. And we do have a question, and that is from Wolfgang. He will have a question to you. So please, Wolfgang, if anyone else had a question, please raise your hand in the chat. Wolfgang?
And thank you very much, Anna, for this excellent and very clear presentation. I was just wondering, you put your emphasis on the drawbacks around dispute settlements, but the other side is the rulemaking leg of the WTO, where arguably also there are some advantages and some of the disadvantages. So as we think about perhaps also the interplay between these two, what would you say about then this rulemaking side of things? What can we learn from it? What lessons should we perhaps draw not to repeat in other regimes?
That's a very good
Anna,
question.
I have another question from Sirkak, and he will ask, and then after you get your reply, and then after Julian. Okay, Sirkak.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I just have a question on the dichotomy between, the narratives in the trade dispute settlement regime versus the investment regime. After the appellate body became kind of dysfunctional with the US measure, so there's a move to make it a single panel system where, the appellate body that ceased to exist. But in the investment side, you have the move with the European Union for the multilateral investment court. So you have a system where the investment regime is trying to, copy the trade regime having an appellate body, and the trade regime saying the appellate body is not really required. So I just want to comment on these two dichotomies. And the second dichotomy is on the ISDS, the criticism of the ISDS system in the investment regime, whereas the state-to-state regime has its own dysfunctionalities, as you mentioned in the trade body. So how do you see these two dichotomies playing out in the two regimes? Thank you.
Ricard, if you are not, there will perhaps be also an overlap, not overlap, but some part of your questions will be also addressed by Paula Baldini, because she will work on the investment dispute resolution. If you don't mind, I will give the word to Julian, and then after we go to Anna. Please, Julian.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll quick. Anna, it was a great presentation. What I gather from your talk is also that the appellate body took the lead and the center stage in terms of evolution of the dispute resolution practice over the last 20 years. And on top of this, I think it's today by all experts that the appellate body is obliged to undertake a full de novo review of legal findings of what panel decide. And that's something which I like to ask you about, in particular because there is a very interesting article recently published by Thomas Cotier in the GL, something titled Recalibrating WTO dispute settlement. So it's focusing on what you call the weaknesses, and Cotier is arguing that there is a need for new standards of appellate review. So his point is that basically the appellate body has taken too much power within the WTO system, which has become a weakness. And his arguments, I think in a nutshell, is that the interpretation of the WTO rules should primarily be assigned to the panel stage, and that the appellate body review should be subject to some standards. So there should be some limitation, some constraint placed on the appellate body. And among the many things he discusses, he mentioned the idea of reasonableness. So there should be a new standard of reasonableness applied on the appellate body interpretation in order to limit the tendency of the appellate body to take too much power into that system. So I'd like to know what you think about that, and more generally about the question of the standard of review in WTO.
Thank you so much, Julian. Please, Anna, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you all very much. I think the second question may be best kind of, I can give some of my insights, but maybe indeed Paula will also cover that. But of course, what Wolfgang raised is very important. And I would say that we've seen that on the rulemaking side, there is also not the progress we need in the WTO, and that you know, this is being taken over on a bilateral or you know, plurilateral basis by other power blocks, you know, digital taxes, etc. Just to name some, is a great example of the fact that it's, you know, moving slowly, and you know, that's where other, you know, the EU or the US will take over if the WTO cannot reinvent itself in this sense. And that's where you will see, you know, FTAs going further. You know, my field, I do energy regulation. You can see that the EU just now standard has very elaborate energy chapters in all the FTAs that it's concluding with third countries. And that's something that, you know, even very recently, if you said that energy was relevant in the WTO, you would have WTO employees or, you know, members saying that energy is not at all relevant. So I would say definitely there's a problem on the rulemaking side as well. On the other hand, maybe we shouldn't be overly demanding and idealistic, and also work with what we have, and the agreements that we do have are pretty elaborate and interesting. With regard to Julian's remark, yes, I actually talked to Professor Coutier about this. That was at a conference here in the Netherlands pre-COVID times. And indeed, he was very upset about the standard of review. And he said he was about to write an article about it. And I actually say I very much agree. So I would say, indeed, if you sometimes see how, for instance, the appellate body goes, arguendo, all kinds of facts that are not necessarily relevant, or into all kinds of theories that are not necessarily relevant to just solve the dispute at hand. I think it should really try and restrain itself. And yeah, so this idea of reasonableness, I haven't read the article, but it seems reasonable, in fact. And so I would actually very much agree with that. I agree that the appellate body has gone too far, and I think many agree. That's not to say that there is not brilliant, you know, people who work there and are very knowledgeable, but it should stick to its mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Sirikar, your question perhaps will be a little more addressed by Paula, because it is all about the investment dispute. I just want to give Juliana Cubillos, who is PhD and also helping with the organization of this. Juliana, a question, very quick.
Yes, okay, I will try to be brief. Paula, you were, sorry, Anna, you were talking about that the system was also created with a framework that was really stable and offered the advantage of being less political. But at the end, we noticed that the issues that are having right now are political based. So my question will be, do you think it's the framework in itself what hinders the system to be effective right now? Or it is more about the political aspects that were sort of neglected or hide behind that system, the ones that are targeting or like seeing this downward for WTO?
Well, I think, so thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think what I mentioned at the start of my presentation is that we have a very different membership than we had, let's say, pre-WTO, and let's say from WTO 1995, if you compare it to today. We have very different members who do use the system. I would say they use the system also for political battles. And I'm, for instance, talking about security exceptions, right? So this was an exception that, you know, you could, you know, defend a measure if it was infringing upon your national security. And this was a provision, Article 21 of the GATT, that was basically ignored and closed for decades. Nobody even dared to touch and go into security exceptions. You know, you have Russia joining the WTO, and indirectly the war between Ukraine and Russia comes into play there, because, you know, Russia blocks transit of goods through Ukrainian territory. Ukraine starts a dispute, Russia invokes the security exception saying there is an emergency. So the system is now that you can basically start a war, then violate your WTO rules, unilaterally use that as kind of a unilateral sanction, and that is okay. because it doesn't matter whether you caused the international emergency, but that's how it works now. Yeah, and then you have you know, players like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, etc. So I would say some of these issues were just not so relevant for a long time. Although you could say also in the 80s there was a Nicaragua and US also kind of venturing into security exceptions, but it never made it to the panel stage. So those things are surfacing now, and yeah, are hard to contain because we live in a charged and globalized world, and you can use the WTO forum as one way to litigate certain things. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anna. We have had 3 presentations, and we still have 3 presentations to go. So we will have a break of 10 minutes max. So we will be back here at 3:38 p.m. Of 3:39, just 10 minutes from now. Thank you so much. See you in 10 minutes. So welcome everyone. We are back from our break, and we have 3 presentations to go. And since we did started with some similarities, difference between tax and trade, and then we started with the dispute settlement from the trade perspective, and now we are looking at the investment and the dispute settlement from the investment perspective. And we have Paula Baldini. She's from Brazil, but she's doing her PhD at Leiden University, also on the topic of investment treaties, and we have been also cooperating before looking at the differences between tax and investment. So Paula, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Irma for having me again. It's also Julian and Frederick. I love working together with you. I love your project, and I think it's very interesting. So thank you again. I will be speaking today about the lessons learned from investor-state dispute settlement, but also investment dispute settlement in general. So I find it a bit hard to talk about this topic because I tend to think that investor-state dispute settlement in particularly, despite all the criticism that it faces and that I'm going to explain, I do think that it behaves more or less in the way that we should expect it to, the way that it was designed and the way that it works. So I do find it a bit hard to discuss this topic, but I do think that there's at least one major lesson that we can draw from this kind of criticism. So this is what I'm going to focus. I, again, prepared a short presentation, a bit shorter than 15 minutes, I hope. So we will see. So first I'd like to discuss a bit about what international investment law is, which is something that Wolfgang already addressed, but I'm going to direct it a bit more towards what it can be useful here. So to put it very simply, international investment law is a system where you have states, usually on a bilateral, multilateral basis, but you don't have a general system, but states meet together and they negotiate certain protections for investors under the expectation that these protections will make their markets more attractive, foster investment and foster development out of this, and that they will have mutual economic benefits out of this. The idea behind it is that once you make markets more attractive, you will have more investors coming in naturally. Because it is a system that is negotiated on a bilateral and multilateral basis, you do have an immense amount of treaties. We do have today, if you take a look just at the ones that are active, you have more than, I believe, 3,000 treaties today. Wolfgang has an excellent database that is very useful on those treaties, and that I thank him very much for having it because it saves me every time. And the problem about this is that it's very difficult to generalize about investment law in general, but this is how it is usually discussed in practice. And so this is what we're going to do today, but please bear in mind that nothing that I say will be universal, will be generally applicable, and that we always have exceptions. So how do these treaties work in terms of dispute settlement? You do have 2 main types of dispute settlement that you can see in these treaties. You have interstate dispute settlement, and you do have investor-state dispute settlement. Interstate dispute settlement is a general mechanism of international law, is as old as international law itself. Basically, one state files a claim against another state claiming a violation of a treaty. This can happen both on behalf of an investor through diplomatic protection, or it can happen on a more general basis but we will discuss a bit about how the receptive tribunals are themselves to this. So you can also discuss general violations of treaties. The second form of adjudicating investment disputes that is far more common today, although very exclusive to investment law, is investor-state dispute settlement. Investor-state dispute settlement basically allows an investor that is a party of one of the states that signed the treaty to file claims against the state hosting their investments. It is an unusual form of dispute settlement, particularly because the investors are not party to the treaties themselves, but the states delegate to them the authority and the capacity of filing those claims on behalf based on a violation of the treaty. So there are a few things to mention about these two types of dispute settlement. First, they are not exclusive. It's very common for you to have treaties that have both interstate and investor-state dispute settlement. The US model treaty used to have this option. I think it still does, but at least it had for some time, and there wasn't at least one claim on this, discussing this possibility of interstate dispute settlement. Despite them existing together, investment dispute settlement became incredibly popular and surpassed interstate dispute settlement by far. So today we have more than 2,000, I believe, investor-state arbitration claims, and many of them are still ongoing. And it is a very prolific field where a number of lawyers have acted there, and it's showing that it's growing over time. It hasn't stopped to grow for the past 20 years, I would say. Another issue of that is that one of the reasons why it's so popular is because tribunals themselves have favored investor-state dispute settlement. They tend to like this form of dispute settlement. There are discussions of why, but in part is because it is believed that it is a relatively neutral form for solving those disputes, or at least it was believed that it was a relatively neutral form to solve these disputes. And despite all that popularity and all that growth that we saw in the past years, or mainly because of that, we do see a number of state complaints surrounding investor-state dispute settlement. These complaints, they have been growing. They are not new. They started, they're possibly as old as investor-state dispute settlement is itself. And when investment arbitration started to grow, you did see a number of developing countries that questioned how the system could affect their interests and how it could affect their right to sovereignty, especially economic sovereignty. However, they still took part of the system, believing that it would be beneficial to everyone. And today, these complaints have been growing for a number of reasons. I'm going to go a bit about these complaints. They are, I'm not going to go through all of them because some of them are very specific. So it's impossible to go through all of them in 15 minutes. But from a general point of view, one of the common complaints that we see is that arbitrators are seen often as biased and incapable of solving the disputes and not knowing domestic realities as well as they should. A second common problem is a second common complaint is about inconsistency of decisions. So when you have that many agreements that nevertheless follow the same lines, but they have nuances between them, and you have so many cases, it's very difficult for tribunals to be able to be consistent in the first place. But states have argued that this lack of consistency does not allow them to plan their actions accordingly. It does not allow them to be able to predict that and reduce their liability based on investment disputes. And so this is one of the major points. It's also one of the reasons why it has been discussed the possibility of an appellate body or a centralized body. Another point that is often discussed and subject to a number of complaints is about how to compatibilize investment protections with other obligations that states have internationally. in particular, most of the complaints that we see are related to environmental obligations, human rights that they have towards their own citizens, such as right to health and right to access to water. And based on that, because basically what happens is that they complain that tribunals tend to privilege the investor protections instead of these rights. And because of this, then we have the next one, which is because of the high risk created by investment arbitration, and because the states believe that tribunals tend to privilege their investor protections over other obligations that they have, they tend to avoid sometimes making certain steps that they believe are necessary, but that they think that could generate liability to them and their investment obligations. Recently, I believe it was last year, that Peru was backed off from a law on healthcare, I think, because they thought that this could generate a liability to them under investment treaties, and they backed off from that law. And there was some uproar among Peruvian lawyers about this, but it is at least a perceived risk that some states have. The last part is that developing states today, they believe that since there is not incomplete evidence about the benefits of international investor-state arbitration, they wonder if it is still worth being part of that kind of dispute settlement. They expected that they would see a very significant height in increase in incoming investment flows, and they say that they don't see that and that they do not get the benefits that they expected from that. There is a number of research studies on that, and what it is generally agreed is that you can get benefits out of that, but many conditions, that alone is not enough, and that there are many conditions at play and many circumstances at play, and that it's very difficult for you to actually benefit from this just by joining an agreement that has an investor-state dispute settlement clause. But it seems that developing states did expect more out of this. In general, what we see in all these complaints and what they all have in common, I believe that there is one very big thing that they do have in common, which is the fact that they expected investor-state arbitration. First, they expected investor-state arbitration not to be that big and not to be that influential and not to be that common. They did not expect it to be such a big part of their everyday activities, and for it to play such a big role in their planning, policy planning, and internal politics. In fact, what is often said, and a number of internal documents, if you take a look at developing countries, transitioning countries, such as former Soviet economies, and I believe South American states as well, is that they actually believed for a very long time that what they were saying is that, okay, we will treat your investments well, and we will respect them, and here's a dispute settlement method for you to be sure of that. And they did not expect to see that many cases so easily that would question their internal laws and their internal policies this way. So I do believe that what we say, that these complaints that we see today and these reported problems that we see today are actually a result of an inconsistency between what many states believe are their powers and what many states believe are their rights as sovereigns, and what international investor-state dispute settlement sees itself, and what are the powers of tribunals that were granted in these cases. So I tend to see that this is, in general, state powers versus investor-state dispute settlement powers. For the consequence of this is that the critics of investor-state dispute settlement, they say that the fact that this was so unexpected and that it went so beyond what they believed means that the system is not doing what it's supposed to do. It goes beyond what they expected from it. It goes beyond what would be even their consent in some cases. And those who defend it say that the system may not be perfect. Of course, it has mistakes, as everything does, but that in the end they are doing what they are supposed to do. The fact that it became much bigger than they expected does not take away the fact that they are doing this. In practice, what we end up seeing is that tribunals have tried to respond in many ways to these complaints. There is an excellent study by Langford and Ben, where they discuss how tribunals have narrowed down their interpretations over time in response to many of the complaints against investor-state dispute settlement. But still, there's only so much that a tribunal can do alone without a broader, more substantial reform. So if we take a look at what types of reform options have been presented so far, as Wolfgang mentioned, there is a movement towards reforming investor-state arbitration. And so the first type of reform that is more common that we see is the individual reform, which is states basically bilaterally, they either terminate agreements or they try to renegotiate the terms, especially focusing on establishing more limits and making rules clear for what arbitrators are allowed and expected to do or not. This is a very limited option because it does not allow them to do broader reforms, and it also depends a lot on the state's bargaining power. So many of the power relations that are often discussed, they tend to repeat themselves in these types of negotiations. We also have a broader movement right now, especially at the UN Central, to reform investor-state dispute settlement specifically and focus on procedural rules. For some time over the past few years, since the Commission was established 2 years ago, it was they discussed many different options, but it seems based on the latest documents that they sent that they want to focus specifically on procedural rules to tackle the specific complaints that have been presented. It's a solution, and it's an option that is very efficient in the sense that changing just procedural rules would not require negotiating every treaty, because you just choose the rules that are applicable to the dispute, and then you can move on with reforming those rules. However, many states have wondered, and many policymakers have also wondered whether this would be enough to tackle many of the systemic issues that they report. You also have the option of a broader, more systemic reform, which is basically you revamp the system. So you can establish a permanent court that allows investors to file claims against states. You can put a different body that would be a formal fixed appellate body. You can change whatever you want. It's this is particularly advocated by some policymakers and lawyers that are very aligned to what Wolfgang mentioned with the WTO, and that they tend to advocate towards a stable court that would be able to solve problems such as appointment of arbitrators because they would already be there. It would also solve problems of consistency because it would be a single institution judging them, and they will presumably or would be expected to follow similar standards. But it is a slow process. It's a process that could be very costly, and it is also uncertain because we don't know whether it would work or not. And lastly, there is the radical decision, which is discarding investor-state arbitration and go for different solutions. This is a solution that a number of developing states have advocated for, including Brazil. Brazil never took part, never ratified an investment agreement that had a dispute settlement, an investor-state dispute settlement clause. And they tend to focus on more informal decision-making that actually have states participating in it. The advantage of this is that it gives states back control over their dispute settlement system. They are able to participate actively in it, and if it interferes with issues that they believe that are going beyond what the dispute settlement system is supposed to be, they can act and they have a bit more control over it. At least this is what they expect from it. Also, very difficult to say whether this would work or not. Alternatives of this may actually increase complaints because investor-state dispute settlement is also made for investors. And if they're not able to access it, they need to go back to, depending on the states, to file claims for them. It will be much more costly. It will be much harder for you to actually have the system moving forward. And it's also a question of whether you can go back after you already, if it's possible to do this at this point, the way that it exists right now. among these very different options,
Paula, you have half a minute.
Okay, I'm finishing. Among these very different options, what I would say that the difference here and the main point that I want to make is that none of these solutions are perfect. None of these solutions are capable of addressing every complaint that states have today, especially because this relates to what states consider important for their sovereignty and for their autonomy. I do tend to think that in terms of tax, and this is what I think that tax lawyers can learn from this and should take a look when thinking about their own dispute settlement methods, is what is the place that tax plays in their economic sovereignty? What is the value that it has for their own system and for their own autonomy? And how far are they willing to go into opening this up and having a tribunal working without them participating in these decisions? Do you want them to do this? I wonder. In many ways, we can already have a small glimpse of this in investor-state dispute settlement, because a number of bilateral investment agreements already have dispositions excluding tax issues from the applications of certain protections. And nevertheless, those protections is 33% of claims based on a sample that I drew, still include at least one tax-related claim. So once you have a system that is not so much under your control, you need to think about whether this is convenient and about whether this is what you want for your system. Because if it doesn't work, then you won't be happy with that system in the end, and it's doomed to fail.
Thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you.
Since there were not so many questions, I gave you a little more of time, because I think that you are mentioning a very, very important topic. And the problem is that when we look at the BEPS and we look at the MLI and we look at the dispute resolution, for instance, and the provisions for mutual agreement procedure, but also some of the countries also following arbitration, one of the questions that is being asked is about the tax sovereignty, but also the fiscal sovereignty. So, and for instance, in investment, I know that countries, especially in Latin America, have wondered why an investment tribunal will decide on the fiscal sovereignty and will decide whether a specific measure is expropriation, yes or not. This discussion and the reason why we have today this dispute settlement is to give you an introduction to what is coming after, because in the session of June 17, organized by Julian Chase, there will be one session completely about dispute settlement of disputes from investment, trade, and tax perspective. Another point that I want to make here, since I still do not see questions, so I'm taking the time and perhaps see what Paula thinks about, is why I see also, for instance, UNCITRAL is very much in the process. So then it means that from all the investment dispute mechanisms, UNCITRAL is taking the lead. But UNCITRAL is also taking the lead, but looking at what the BEPS and the MLI have done for investment dispute. So then I will say nothing more because Wolfgang is going to ask a question. So please, Wolfgang, go ahead, and then Paula will reply.
Thank you, Emma. I just want to quickly react to Paula's excellent presentation. There was one thing that I hear often and that I read often, and that's the characterization of putting together something like a multilateral investment court as a systemic reform. Of course, it's a bold step, but really it only touches procedure and not substance. And as I think you've rightly said, most of the concerns are actually substantive. So what do you think about providing procedural solutions to fix substantive problems? Is there not a way to tackle that problem differently? Learning from tax, for instance.
Give me 1 second, because you have Howard and you have Scott, so we put all together because it will be very short on time for the reactions. Howie, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Irma, and thank you and your colleagues for inviting me to join this process. I really appreciate it. Just very quickly on Wolfgang's last question, our procedural solutions a good way to address the substantive issues? And the answer, of course, is no, they aren't. But part of the problem is you have an UNCITRAL process on reform that is being led by people who want to minimize the amount of reform and justify the existing regime as much as possible as it is currently structured. So both the chair of the process and the chair of the secretariat are really minimalist in terms of their ambition for reform. And so you have a number of states trying to squeeze substantive reforms into the notion of procedural reforms, because procedural reforms are substantive reforms are simply being ruled inadmissible, if I can put it that way, in the process. More specifically, I did want to comment, Paula, when you started by saying that you thought the system was working as it was designed. And so some of the complaints may be kind of artificial in the sense that expectations should have been more consistent with the results that we see. But I think there's two fundamental things that have been very different, and I'm not going to even talk in terms of technical issues. The first is the system was conceived as a shield, and essentially a shield of last resort. But instead, and we see this in the numbers, it's become a sword for companies, for foreign investors, and a sword of first resort, and a very powerful one because of the other imbalances built into the system. And the result of that is the second feature that's very, very different than what was anticipated, and that's that investor-state arbitration, private companies suing states, has become a multi-billion-dollar business over the last years. And we see the impacts of that in terms of the sizes of the law firm departments, the number of cases, the amount of money involved. Literally, £1,000 an hour is not unusual as a fee. It's just not unusual anymore, which when you stop and think about it is insanity. And I say that as a lawyer. And so you have these mechanisms now, and it's the lawyers, the arbitrators, the arbitral institution, the third-party funders, the evaluators. Everybody needs to get paid from the system, and the result of that, when we play it through, is the growth in the size of the awards against governments, because that's what pays for everybody to make money in the system. In other words, suing governments has become big business. And that has distorted a lot. And I think there are real governance issues that come out of those two factors. And when we talk about transferring the, and I'll speak about this also in the last session, when we talk about transferring the experience of ISDS and investment law to tax, we need to look at those issues from a real governance perspective. Sure, empirically, it is possible to simply make that transfer, but should we be making that transfer, and what are the governance consequences of making that transfer, especially in the realm of tax, where institutionally secrecy is still the primary value that's attached to the arbitration process for tax arbitration, and that is fundamentally incompatible with governance of a public system.
Thank you so much, Howard. Scott, please go ahead. If you can make it a little short, because Paula, you will have to reply.
Believe it or not, I'll be very brief. Excuse me, I'm picking up mostly, although it's interesting listening to Howard's comments, mine coincide with them in a slightly different way, particularly from a tax perspective, because that's how I know things. You said in your introduction to these questions, or asked the question, what has BEPS and the MLI done for dispute resolution? And contrarian as I may be, I would say not much, certainly not yet, but I don't mean to be glib about it. one of the questions that I think is overlooked in discussions like this and the more tax-centric discussions, or one of the awarenesses, is that many countries still don't have treaties. And so if you don't have a treaty, then the MLI is of very little effect. And additionally, and particularly in some countries, although it's little discussed, countries are having tax treaties not because they want them, but because they are imposed upon them by nations which, as part of the trade negotiation process, will not have a trade treaty with those countries unless they also get a tax treaty. And one of the things that they tend to want to accomplish with a tax treaty is a measure of networking, or to put it in a less polite way, treaty shopping for their own benefit. In the tax context, I think too, arbitration is not meant to happen. That is, arbitration is supposed to be a discipline of tax authorities who will not then present cases in their mutual agreement procedures that would be considered to be insubstantial. So that is a difference, I think, from investment treaty-based arbitrations, which leads to another observation, which is UNCITRAL arbitrations, and notably where that mechanism, investment trade treaty mechanism, has been used in a tax context, tend to be trials by another name, which picks up a comment which Howard was making. That is, they involve discovery process, many experts, discovery, extended sessions, cross-examination even, and the arbitrators essentially acting as judges to formulate their own decision. One might wonder, thinking about the criticisms that have been made commonly about the mutual agreement procedure in tax, how useful that is for getting determinations in a tax context in a multilateral world that craves them. And then the last question I guess I would ask for tax people is whether or not the typical baseball style arbitration, which one finds in tax for those countries who have adopted arbitration, and even as a recommended approach in the MLI, it might be a more useful, might be more useful if the arbitrators themselves, without a UNCITRAL arbitration kind of a context, had the opportunity to come to their own decision independently of the cases that were presented to them, so that they can present essentially a mediated compromise, so to speak, to the countries and their taxpayers, so that they can kind of make a more qualified decision. That's all I would say.
Thank you so much, and I believe that this is just the beauty of this workshop, just having one person from investment and one person from tax and discussing this. So I'm just taking a moment for myself to enjoy this. Paula, you will have to be very quick for your reaction, but remember that on the June 17, we will also have the same discussion on dispute settlement. So perhaps just one comment that you can say, or one sentence that you say, this is what we should be as tax lawyers focusing from investment.
So I think I can actually answer, since they are so related, I think it's not too hard to answer quickly. From a general point of view, in terms of when I say that investment arbitration is doing what it's designed for, I tend to believe that what I meant is that it is meant to be used, and the powers of the arbitrators are in many ways what we should, in hindsight, expect them to be. And I do agree that it was seen as an ultima ratio initially, but I do see the multiplication of cases also a consequence of the judicialization of international relations and international law in many ways. You can see this multiplication of cases also in other areas of international law and international dispute settlement. And I think that in investment arbitration in particular, we see them growing more because it's easier to find a client. You don't need a state as a client. And therefore, since it's easier, law firms can really profit from that. It's the common say that people say that states may not be very happy about that, but lawyers are for sure.
Definitely.
I'm just going to say one last thing. This being said, when we talk about procedural solutions to substantive problems, I do think that in many ways they are trying to, because it's convenient and lawyers like it, we are trying in many ways to reduce the impact of maybe ditching a system like that. However, I do think that we can do that and keep using the system if we try to standardize more in terms of substantive issues that are coming.
Yeah.
In many ways, you can do this by establishing standard designations. There are many studies in terms of customary international law and how customary international law is part of investment law, that they seem to be trying to find this way around. But there are ways that states can agree on more or less standard types of standards for investment protections, and that then states can pick which ones they want. We have this in commercial law with Incoterms, for example. So I don't see why it wouldn't be possible to do that in investment law.
Thank you so much, Paula. But
Thank you.
I need to move to the other
I'm
speakers
done.
because we have three. And then one of the things that is important is just we are going to also upload the PowerPoint presentations. There will be the recording. So by the time that we get to June 17, you will already have to review these presentations again, and also the recording. So let's go to the final two presentations. And this presentation is by Ricardo Garcia Anton from the University of Tilburg and Tony Marshall from the University of Glasgow. He will look at the proportionality review of fiscal measures, since there are two speakers, but they will also have 15 minutes like everyone. So I will give the word to Tony. Please, Tony, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tony. I am going to start our presentation, which is a duet with my friend and compatriot Ricardo. This is the focus of our paper is going to be on judicial review of tax measures or tax-related measures through a comparative perspective, and with a focus on EU law, WTO, and investment treaty arbitration. Okay, now this is very much work in progress. We very much encourage any sort of comments or criticisms from you, and this is part of the reason we would like to present. We are starting with, let me present our starting hypothesis or starting intuition, which is that there is, to put it in very blunt terms, that there is something special about taxation, and especially in two different senses. So the first is in that the intuition is that the models of judicial review that have been developed essentially elsewhere, and constitutional adjudication is the main source of where these models are taken from, that these models of judicial review are not necessarily appropriate for tax cases. And as many of these cases that we'll be discussing can show. But secondly, also taxation, especially in the sense that taxation can serve as a test case to test the accuracy of these models that have been developed elsewhere. That is to say that taxation is not just special in the sense that those models don't necessarily work, but also that taxation shows that those models in general are not necessarily accurate, or there is something amiss with those models. Okay, now we're going to now. So this is let's start with some basic assumptions. Now, where are some starting ideas about proportionality? So we're going to be focusing on proportionality as the most important tool used today to carry out judicial review in these various contexts that we're going to be focusing on. So the first idea, the first starting assumption is that there's a widespread idea that proportionality is understood as synonymous with balancing of interests, or perhaps a more rationalized or a more systematized understanding of balancing. So that is to say, what does proportionality involve? It involves the judge identifying the different interests at stake and that are conflicting in a particular case, weighing them against each other, and in view of the circumstances, finding in favor of the interest that has most weight, right? So that's sort of quite a widespread idea. The second is, I'd like to talk about the irresistible quality of proportionality, in as much as it is based on a fundamental intuition about the nature of adjudication. So, or to put it in very blunt terms, to judge is essentially to balance. And so, you know, this idea that any legal case is essentially a case about weighing interest, and therefore this is what a judge or an adjudicator should be doing. This is so ingrained in our minds, I think, in contemporary jurisprudence, especially since the beginning of the 90s, that it's become very difficult to think of legal reasoning in any other terms other than through balancing. The third idea is that when you take these sort of assumptions to the domain of taxation, and proportionality being widespread to domestically and internationally in all branches of the law, taken to the context of taxation, this means that we will approach the problem of judicial review by thinking of it as a clash or a conflict that the judge needs to arbitrate between, on the one hand, something like tax fairness or tax collection against legal certainty. Okay. Now, what we wish to argue, or our essential claim, is that there is nothing inevitable about proportionality or balancing as a framework of legal reasoning in the context of taxation, but also beyond that. And it is so because there is, in proportionality or in balancing, it's a very specific and idiosyncratic way of framing legal problems. And Wolfgang before was talking about what it means to frame something, and this is exactly what we're talking about. It's conducive to focusing on certain aspects of any particular problem, but also on obscuring others, and in ways that can be detrimental, in particular in the tax context. So what are the two of the most distinctive characteristics of proportionality? The first would be something that we can refer to as its functionalism or instrumentalism. That is to say, this means that when reviewing a particular measure through the lens of proportionality, the measure is going to be viewed, going to be framed as a tool to advance a certain goal, and therefore is going to be judged as such. That is to say, on the basis of how good it is, how efficient it is at advancing that goal, at which cost, etc., and whether that goal is promoting security or happiness or investment or animal welfare, whatever it is. Okay, so that's the first sort of basic characteristic of proportionality, which has its reverse. It means that it excludes other types of arguments that are non-utilitarian. So for example, arguments based on authority. This measure is good because it comes from an authority that has competence to adopt such measures, regardless of whether the measure is subject to any utilitarian calculus or not. Or arguments based on principle, such as, let's say, it's consistent with human dignity, something like that, right? So that's the first idea. The second is universality. And what I mean by that is that this relates to what is put in the balance when carrying out this form of legal reasoning. So cases, when viewed through the lens of proportionality, cases become conflicts about universal values. And universal also in as much as no one will dispute that they are valid and relevant considerations. So privacy, rule of law, promotion and investment, these are ideas that everybody will agree are good ideas and should be maximized. Of course, the conflict will arise about where exactly at which point they should be balanced, or at which point the compromise should be reached between them. But the ideas in themselves are held to be universally valid. And so conversely, this means that we are going to be setting aside particular or individual interests or interests of specific groups. So for instance, you're not going to balance the interest of Spaniards against Germans, or Catholics against Muslims, or men against women. And that's not how proportionality works. Now, why is this framework awkward in the taxation context? Now, on the one hand, if you focus on these two sort of basic points, I think what we're going to be arguing, and now after this I will pass it on to Ricardo, who will be illustrating through more of this specific cases. But essentially, there is something awkward about proportionality for the taxation context, and that actually, if you look closely at the taxation context, even though they are very often using the language of proportionality because this language is so popular, in reality, something else is going on. So first of all, consider the question of universality. Universality is very much tends to be lacking. First of all, because it's difficult to justify fiscal measures on the basis of universal values. So the interests that are being pursued are clearly those of a particular entity or a particular group, usually a state, the state in question, who is seeking to maximize its tax revenue. And sometimes tribunals will try to make it seem like the state is an agent of a global good, such as the fight against money laundering or something like that. But most often it's quite transparent that this is just a matter of the state trying to just raise more money for itself. And secondly, also within the universality point, there is no such conflict of universal values because that interest of the state in raising revenue is almost never balanced against other countervailing interests, even though the language of proportionality is used. The second point is about functionalism. In fact, there's a tendency and Ricardo is now going to be focusing a lot on this point, arguments often, so cases about judicial review of tax measures are very often reduced to cases about the proper extent of states of jurisdiction or states' fiscal authority. Now consider a typical sort of tax avoidance case, right? So there will have been a reallocation of profits by the corporation in question, passing through some formal legal engineering to minimize its tax bill. The state will then nevertheless react by taxing those profits and acting as if that reallocation had not happened and justifying its taxation as seeking to combat tax avoidance. And so the challenge will be brought to the adjudicator, whichever adjudicator that may be, who will not then examine this through the lens of a utilitarian calculus. He will not then consider, well, what goals are being advanced through this particular tax, etc. Instead, it will be focusing on, can the state legitimately treat the profits as located within its area of fiscal authority? So through judicial review, what adjudicators are doing is they are delineating the perimeter of legitimate exercise of state prerogative. I will pass it on to Ricardo here, but maybe I can be clicking on the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much for organizing for this opportunity to present our ideas or intuitions. And basically, what Tony was saying, this idea that these two arguments, these two narratives that we can find in proportionality, instrumentalism, and universalism, we don't find when the courts deal with that case in different courts. This is the reason in our research we have picked up cases in WTO, in arbitration tribunals, and also the Court of Justice European Union. And the idea was which kind of cases we can pick up. So we decided to focus on abuse, no? In cases of abuse, because we see several common patterns, common, let's say, thread in how all the courts deal with abuse, no? And we will see in our claim, as Tony was saying before, that when the court refer to proportionality, or even in WTO, that proportionality is not in the WTO treaties, but many commentators said that what the appellate body or the panel says works is with this kind of proportionality device, try to balance in different interests. We don't see when we talk about abuse. And we will see two dimensions. We will see clear what Tony was saying, a substantive dimension. This is an idea of who has to tax, the right to collect taxes, and also this procedural dimension. Okay, the state, the tax authorities have to prove that the transactions are abusive. So what were we doing with this paper? We try to combat, to struggle, to challenge this classical narrative that tried to say, well, on one hand, we have legal certainty, and on the other hand, we have tax fairness. So proportionality is something, the tool that try to find the balance between tax fairness and tax legal certainty. So this is not true. This is not true. But can you pass, Tony, pass the next slide? Yeah. So it is not true. And then we start, for instance, with the Court of Justice European Union when dealt with abuse. And then we see the case SIAT, the case in a nutshell. In this case, the Belgian tax authority denied the deductibility of certain business expenses because the income was not taxed in the recipient, in the Luxembourg company, because in Luxembourg, as you may know, there was a tax regime that exempt this income. No? Of course, when the courts deal with this particular case, abuse, immediately we go to the justifications that we can see consistently in all the courts. No? We try to find a justification. Of course, in EU law, we find this justification, the fight against tax avoidance and evasion. No? The famous that in EU law is labeled as balanced allocation of tax. So the courts really mention this idea of proportionality test, the idea of balancing interest. And then many in the tax literature, we can see here, yes, this is the real, the Court of Justice said that this measure is not proportional. Therefore, there is a victory of the legal certainty. So many also scholars in tax literature claim that the PPT, the principal purpose test, is also a breach of the legal certainty principle. But in our view, if you read what is behind the lines, what is in the court, it's clear there is an idea of territoriality. No? Belgium has the right to tax, but the problem that it needs the tax authority in Belgium that they didn't deal, the law was automatically applicable. They need to prove that there is a wholly artificial arrangement. So the Court of Justice, what is saying in this judgment is, yes, Belgium has the right to tax, but please prove that this behavior is abusive, that this arrangement between this company, Belgian company, and this Luxembourgish company is a abusive arrangement. No? So this is not a classical dichotomy between legal certainty and tax fairness. It's simply like Belgium, you need to tax this income, but please prove that this is a wholly artificial arrangement. So this is again these two dimensions, this substantive dimension and this procedural dimension. Next slide, Tony. Yeah, then we go to arbitration tribunals, and we pick up a famous case, Kern Energy. It was a case of indirect transfer of participations. So in 2006, there were sales of an offshore company, a Jersey company, offshore area, of course, by a UK resident. And of course, this Jersey company has in his assets active companies in India. So India in this moment reacted. India didn't have a guard at that time. So India reacted, say, well, I need to, in a way, tax this indirect transfer of shares because neither India nor UK could tax this sale of participation on an offshore company. So what happened? India introduced this retroactive amendment of his income, corporate income tax, to allow, well, that you can tax this indirect transfer of share retroactively. So, well, the problem in this in this award, and when we read it, is an issue whether or not this amendment of India was, let's say, a retroactive legislation or was simply a clarification. Was it a breach of the principle of fair equitable treatment? Next slide. So what we trying to find again this narrative of proportionality, and we see in the paragraph 1007-89, we see this idea that is in the arbitrators, this idea of proportionality as balancing interest, as balancing exercise between India public policy, let's say tax fairness, they raise the right to raise revenue, and let's say, the tax claimant of predictability or legal certainty. So the court, when we read this, we say, well, it's doing this kind of balancing. But in our view, this is not such a proportionality according to our theoretical or normative framework. What is happening here is India has the right to tax this capital gain for an indirect transfer of share, but India couldn't prove that these transactions were abusive. So in the world, if you read from the paragraph 160 to 159 point, these all many paragraphs, India couldn't prove that this arrangement was abusive. So what is happening in this particular case? In our view, that the focus India argued that double non-taxation, that was in the particular case because this income was neither taxed in UK nor in India, just is abusive per se. This is the real problem because double non-taxation is not always abusive. Therefore, in our view, India has the right to tax, but should have focused the argumentation, the arguments, trying to prove that, well, this Jersey company was constituted 2 months before the sale of the participation. There was no economic activity in the Jersey company. So there was, in taking to the vocabulary of our PPT, the main purpose of the transaction was obtaining a tax advantage. No? So this is the point. Again, it's not an issue of proportionality as a balancing interest between legal certainty and tax fairness. It's an issue of maybe in this case, India has the right to tax, but please prove that not all cases of double non-taxation are abusive. You need to really prove it. Next slide. Then we go again to appellate body of WTO. I will not get into much detail because there were presentations before, but here again, this idea of justification, that we have seen in many cases when we talk to Article 20, the exception, the general exception to prevention of deceptive practice. Again, if we go to the vocabulary of the language that is used in the Court of Justice of the European Union, again, it's a sort of balanced allocation of taxing rights. It's the same kind of justification. So how do the court, the panel and the appellate body deal with this justification? We can, next slide, please. So next slide, I mean, just briefly, because Pedro was presenting to you what was the Argentina-Panama case in WTO. It's very curious when we read this judgment that in the paragraph 7.681 to 87682, Panama argue in this idea of proportionality. And Panama argued that these measures that Argentina introduced to, let's say, penalize investments in a non-cooperative jurisdiction, presenting in this dichotomy. No, well, this is a clear dichotomy between tax certainty and legal and tax fairness. But the panel rejected this argumentation, and the panel agree with Argentina that the state has the right to follow, to chase abusive behaviors. And of course, Panama could not prove any alternative measures less restrictive to trade. So in our view, this narrative that tries to present like abuse as, or the proportionality as something to balancing interest between legal certainty and tax fairness is not right. No? In the last slide, and that's conclusion, please. So we have tried to prove, and this is also something we are going to try to argue more in detail in the paper, why, of course, the court deal and mention this idea of proportionality, but at the end of the day, we are talking something different. We cannot follow this normative discussion proportionality narrative that Tony was presenting based on instrumentalism, on universalism. Here is the state has the right to tax collection and prevent abusive behavior, but there is an important procedural dimension. You need to prove that these transactions are abusive. Now, this is something that we can call it in a way that proportionality is ill-suited for tax cases involving different regimes. So please don't call it proportionality when there is something involved. No? With that, I think I finish.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I will ask Tony to stop sharing the screen. Unfortunately, you took the time from the questions. But it doesn't really matter because I think that you guys are working on the paper. So we can also work on in the chat if you have any comments or questions. If there is a very urgent question clarification, I may have time for only one, but then your reply should be really short. I was wondering, is there any question clarification? No? Okay, so then if there is any comments, please ask them in the chat. And we have 20 minutes to finalize when we have the other presentation. Javier is Garcia Olmedo from Queen Mary University and also Council of FOLEC Hague. He is representing also states in investment dispute settlements. With Javier, we agree that he will organize it in another way. So that will be kind of some statements, arguments, and then there will be time for the discussion. So we will have this at the same time, but Javier, then you will have, I believe, 10 minutes for your presentation and 10 minutes for discussion. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Irma, and thank you very much for inviting me to present today. And I'm gonna try to even shorter. I'm sorry, I have to say, first of all, I'm sorry that I'm late. I joined the discussion late because I had a class that I couldn't get rid of. But I'm here now, which is what counts. So thank you again. And I believe there's gonna be some sort of repetition in what I'm going to say in my presentation after hearing Paula's presentation and the comments that came after. And so I'm sorry about that. So I think that for me it will be interesting to be very brief and to raise a couple of arguments that I would like to discuss with you, with the participants. So yes, so the intention is to be quite short in that respect. So my presentation raises a very simple question, and the question relates to the current reforms that we have in investment and tax regimes with respect to dispute settlement. Now we know that there has been what has been described as a legitimacy crisis in both fields, and several concerns have been raised with respect to the nature and the functioning of dispute settlement mechanisms under tax and investment treaties. And if you see current developments, and again, this has been discussed briefly by Paula before, you see that there is like a tendency, there is a trend towards fragmentation with respect to dispute settlement. We have reforms that establish and create different systems and procedures to respond to the concerns that have been raised in both regimes. And so the question I would like to raise in my presentation is, do we need fragmentation? Do we need to fragment dispute settlement in both fields? Do we need to create more and more soft law and procedures and mechanisms, dispute settlement mechanisms to answer, to respond to the concerns that have been raised in both fields? So if we start with the investment treaty arbitration regime, I think I don't want to spend too much time on this because Paula did a bit of my work on it. She already mentioned some of the concerns. So we have lack of consistency, limitations on the state's ability to regulate in the public interest, lack of independence and impartiality of arbitrators, excessive cost and duration of proceedings. And so if you now look at the reforms that have been implemented and adopted and proposed, for example, in the framework of the Antitrust Working Group 3 to respond to these concerns, we see this tendency, we see this fragmentation. No? We have the investment court system proposed by the EU, to judicial structure. We have first instance and appeal mechanism, decisions take presidential value. Courts interestedly will, the members of the courts will interestedly be appointed by state, not by arbitrator, by investors. And these, we can already see this system in trade and investment agreements signed by the EU with third states. One of them is CETA, just to mention one example. We have another type of mechanism already mentioned by Paula, thank you. So intrastate arbitration. So an increasing number of states have decided to get rid of ISDS and instead promote an intrastate procedure to resolve investment disputes between investors and states. So we have, it's a sort of like the typical form of diplomatic protection. That was the reason why ISDS was created, if I can put it that way, in the first place. And the other mechanism that we see is exhausting of local remedies. So now, before investors go to ISDS, they have to try to resolve the dispute before national courts in the host country. And if we look at the EU, this is a complete different situation now. Now we know that after the MEA decision, intra-EU investment disputes have to be resolved through domestic courts. Member states and the EU are now discussing what type of alternatives we can have for intra-EU investment disputes. And very recently, I'm pretty sure you're aware of that opinion from the Advocate General Cocotte, where she seems to suggest, it's not clear, 100% clear, but she seems to suggest that probably arbitration agreements concluded between investors and states, member state, which was a question that was left open in AMEA, are possible as long as there is a comprehensive review in the post-award procedure by member states in cases that are issues of incompatibility with EU law. So the question then arises, are these mechanisms, these I would say an obsession of creating more and more mechanisms in dispute settlement to address these concerns? Do they in fact address those concerns? Do they address those concerns individually, collectively? So look at, for example, in interstate arbitration, yes, it provides for greater respect for state sovereignty because the state has more control over the procedure, but I don't think it solves the concerns about lack of consistency, simply because those mechanisms, the one I have seen at least, they don't contain a rule with respect to presidential value of the decisions. Look at the investment court system. Yes, it ensures more consistency because here the decisions from the courts will take presidential value, but it can at the same time threaten the independence and impartiality of arbitrators, simply because now we are on the other side of the spectrum. Now that will appoint the arbitrators. And I think that is another concern, a new type of concern that it's already there, but I think it can be exacerbated, which is that fragmentation of dispute settlement can trigger corporate structuring, also known as treaty shopping. So investors can try to restructure their investment through vehicles in different countries to try to bypass reforms on dispute settlement. For example, in the investment court system, a EU investor can transfer shares through a country incorporated outside the EU to bring a dispute, a VAT dispute against Canada in the case it's making an investment in Canada and expropriated. So now in the tax regime, we have, I'm sure, that I have missed the presentation where it has been discussed what kind of concerns we have, and mainly those concerns relate to the MAP procedure. They include that the MAP procedure doesn't always resolve the dispute, it doesn't always prevent double taxation, very long processes, very expensive processes as well, and most importantly, I think taxpayers have no rights or participation beside the fact that they can initiate the disputes. And again, yeah, we have evolution of an establishment of different mechanisms that have the purpose to deal with those deficiencies, deficiencies that come from the MAP procedure. And we have mechanisms in the OECD Convention, in the MLI, has been already mentioned, the EU Arbitration Convention, and the Dispute Resolution Directive, the EU Dispute Resolution Directive. So I want to focus only on the MLI and the EU, mainly because they are the most recent one that provide the most innovative solution, if I can name it like that. So now it's not working. So MLI, I don't want to explain to you what it is. I think you all have a clear idea. Opt-in convention, members of state party to dialogue taxation treaties can incorporate mechanisms, very different one from the other, that have been implemented in the convention. One is what is known as the last best offer or baseball arbitration. And this is quite interesting for me, being an investment arbitration lawyer. And here the tribunal chooses one of the solutions that has been proposed by the parties. I don't even know if we call that arbitration. I think it's a sort of a mediation, because the tribunal doesn't need to give give reasons as to why it chooses one of the other proposed solution by the tax authorities. And another aspect of that mechanism is that the taxpayer is excluded; it cannot participate in the process, or at least the participation is very limited. The other mechanism, very different, to baseball arbitration, independent opinion. Here is more akin to a commercial dispute, commercial arbitration dispute or proceedings. Why? Because the tribunals will make a decision, or the panel will make a decision based on the arguments and evidence of the parties. Again, the taxpayer is not included, doesn't participate in this process. So we have 30 jurisdictions out of 295 that are party to the MLI that have opted for mandatory arbitration. Most prefer final offer arbitration, baseball arbitration, others prefer independent opinion. I'm sorry I'm going quick because I would like to have the discussion later on. So EU Dispute Resolution Directive, why do we have there two different systems? We have advisory commission arbitration based on independent opinion procedure, similar to the independent opinion procedure that we have under the MLI. The panel can make determination based on the arguments and evidence of the parties. Here, interestingly, as opposed to the MLI, the EU is attempting to provide more rights. The taxpayer can participate in the process through sending documents, evidence being heard throughout the procedure. Then we have the other type of mechanism proposed by the directive. The Alternative Dispute Resolution Commission can also take the form of a standing committee in member state wish so. And here it's interesting to know that the Commission gives sort of flexibility in the choice of the dispute resolution method. So you can have a type of baseball arbitration under that procedure. You can have mediation, I suppose, conciliation, and here too, the taxpayer has more rights or participation. And here, for me, the question, and here I have more doubts as to the accuracy of my position of my arguments, but I'm not sure if the mechanism will solve the problems that I described. Well, I think in a way they will, because if now we have mandatory arbitration in the tax authority do not resolve the MAP procedure within 2 years time limits, then you have the opportunity to go to arbitration. So in a way it encourages the tax authorities to come to a solution. So I think that's a positive aspect of it. But there are other concerns that I think that arise in relation to these mechanisms. For example, with respect to baseball arbitration, here, as I mentioned, the tribunal, the panel doesn't need to give reasons as to why it decided to adopt one proposed solution on the other. In the commercial arbitration setting, outside the tax treaty regime, that can rise to a challenge of the awards before national courts. And so then you had the recent opinion again, the recent opinion on the baseball arbitration. They don't ensure consistency and predictability. I think the MLI and the directive are very clear about that. There is no, the decision don't take precedence, so it doesn't have presidential value. And this is a problem that we have in investment law that we are trying now to avoid in investment law, which is what the investment court system does to ensure more consistency in decision making. Then for me, the main problem, and please, I would love you to share your views on that, is again, the recurring problem with the tax regime. What do we do with the taxpayer? I think the EU is trying to give a solution there. I don't know what is going to happen. That is another concern that I have. This hasn't been tested yet. Sometimes I talk to tax lawyers and I ask them, do you have awards? Can we see them? How do arbitrators reason their awards? How do they conduct the proceeding? Apparently they are confidential. I have not seen an award coming from in relation to a dispute come from a tax treaty. And another concern that probably is being overlooked, but it may arise, is fragmentation, is what I mentioned in respect to investment law, foreign shopping, treaty shopping. Now, let's imagine a taxpayer is a resident in a state that has a double taxation treaty with another state that doesn't contain arbitration. It could be a possibility the taxpayer says, I would like to have arbitration. I would like my dispute to be resolved quickly and efficiently. So I'm going to use a corporate vehicle to try to access an arbitration mechanism incorporated in another treaty. I think it's a similar concern in the tax regime when it comes to treaty shopping than in investment law. So I don't know if I took 10. Did I take 10?
But it is okay, because I know that there are already perhaps one of the questions and arguments for you.
Yeah.
So I will give the word then to Wolfgang. He will have a question for you.
I wanted to add a final
okay,
comment. I just wanted to say, I raised another question. Maybe I think policymakers, maybe they should be looking at having a more coherence and comprehensive approach when it comes to the dispute settlement. I don't know, maybe the multilateral investment court that is now being discussed in the framework on the working with free. Maybe it's a solution. I don't know. I know in the tax system, this is having an investment international tax court is something that COCOT will discuss in a different session, I think. But I just wanted to raise that comment as well. And now I leave it there.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
That, there was also a discussion after Paula's presentation by Howard Mann and Scott Wilkie also from an investment and tax perspective on this topic. So it's quite interesting, so we can look at afterwards. Wolfgang?
Thank you. So Javier, that was a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I think the one puzzle that I'm left with is that in many ways, based on what you said, I think investment law is moving a little bit closer to taxation, because many of the things that have been achieved recently in taxation, like this MLI reform or something that investment lawyers would like to see also in the investment space. And so in many ways, investment lawyers want investment law to be more like tax. And even baseball arbitration, Joost Halden a couple of years ago said that this might be an interesting alternative, less sovereignty intrusive alternative to investor state arbitration. At the same time, I think you also said that tax lawyers eye investment law and want tax law to be a little bit more like investment law, as in tax arbitration becomes a little bit more judicialized. And that's a little bit interesting, no? Because maybe we go past each other and then we go a little bit too far. So I think one question for reflection that I would have is, should we meet in the middle? Should we just take the best of both worlds? Or how can we combine this comparative thinking about the two fields so that in the end we are happier with the solution and not just create problems that we import from the other field?
Yeah, and let me, Javier, because there is also another question from Pedro, and Pedro was the first person who presented. So then we will have these two questions, and then I give you time to reply. Pedro?
Yeah, it's almost like a comment. It's so funny to me as a tax person, because if you look at what we have in tax, we essentially, if there is no agreement, the taxpayer foots the bill, right? So it's also not something that is working in a way. So yeah, it's just a comment on coming from this angle, and we look at investment law and we say, oh, we need to get there. So complementing a bit of what Wolfgang was saying.
Please go ahead, Javier.
Well, I think I think that you were trying to address that in your paper, and which you published recently, on how the MLI can serve as a module for investment law. And I think you're pointing at the right direction. But in my view, I think taxpayers, they would like their system to be more akin to investment law than vice versa. Because if we now adopt in investment law baseball arbitration, for example, then we need to start from the premise that in tax law it's an intrastate procedure. So you have to have the map, as I understand. You cannot. I think there have been discussions as to whether we need to map in the first place, and we can get rid of it and then have all the arbitration. But as long as we have map, I don't think investment lawyers will be interested to, because then it's like we come to sort of an intrastate procedure. Now it's true, as I mentioned, that many countries, not many, but an increasing number of states are adopting intrastate arbitration instead of ISDS, but still most BITs, they provide for ISDS. So I think it will be more that the tax lawyer would like to have a system that in investment law. And I think for me, the question there is, and when I discuss this with tax lawyers, they see it as an impossibility. And probably the question that I would like to ask you back is, I mean, is it possible? I think it was raised before, to have a sort of an ISDS regime in tax, to have the taxpayer being completely active in the process, not as the EU directive is suggesting, but even more, and even being able to initiate the dispute and participate in the dispute until the end of the procedure. And I don't think you can take the competent authorities out of the equation. In investment law, you can't states, I mean, there are only one state involved in the process, which is the host country. But I think in tax law, you need to have both competent authorities involved there, because the question is double taxation under the treaty. But I think the key will be there. I think that's what the tax lawyers would like to see, more participation rights in the procedure, as is the opposite extreme in investment law. Yeah, but I don't know if you have time for.
Yeah, I think that we have We have a question from someone in the audience, that is Suraj Khan. Ragan, please go ahead.
Yes, my question to Garcia is, just piggybacking on what Wolfgang asked in terms of convergence between investment law and tax law. I'm just going back, scratching the fundamentals. See, one of the main things between the tax law and the investment law is, you take tax laws, there are only 3 model conventions, OECD, UN, and today all the treaties, largely 80% are mirrored with OECD. But when you look at the investment treaty, there are 60 models, 60 different models in each, including India recently, where I come from, have its own model. So where are we talking about convergence or having a multilateral instrument in an investment law when you have divergence? Am I missing something? Because I don't see a convergence happening when you have so the only way to look at it, have a common set of a model law, which is there intact, which is what I think the investment laws are looking at. So how do you address this gap? I don't see, and again, when it comes to investment law, do you think it's possible to have a common convergence? Because tax law talks about avoidance of taxation, doesn't create an taxing right. But investment law, it's a different ballgame altogether.
Thank you so much. There is one final comment, because you were asking about the taxpayer participation, and we have actually someone from the Minister of Finance in Greece, Katerina Perrou, who has been working on dispute resolution, and she wanted to have always the taxpayer. So I will give her the final comment, and I think for Surtahan, and the question of whether we are talking really about convergence is something that we really need to keep in mind through the whole workshop series. Because at the end of the day, by 1st of July, we will see whether there is convergence or not. Katerina, please go ahead. You have the final comment, and then after Javier to finish, and then I will finish, please.
Thank you very much. It has been very interesting to listen to you all today. Just very briefly, of course, I'm not representing the Ministry of Finance here.
In personal capacity.
You know that it's my academic interest in the research. So the point is, and the difference, and I like what I heard about the judicialization of the mutual agreement procedure and dispute resolution under double tax treaties. And yes, that's exactly the question. When we are talking about the mutual agreement procedure, is it still just a procedure between states that they are deciding how to split the pie? Or is it really about the question, the concern, the complaint of a particular taxpayer who is not happy with the way that the double tax treaty has been interpreted or applied in the particular case? And that is a classic dispute that should be treated as in the same way as any other dispute. This answer will lead us to answer this question will lead us to the next step, which I'm in favor of, and Dirma knows about that since many years, that if the answer, if we move towards the second, and it seems like that, so going closer to bilateral investment treaties, dispute resolution, then I think it is inevitable that the taxpayer is a party in the proceedings in the same way as both tax authorities.
But look at it from how much time do we have left?
2 minutes.
But look, it's a very pertinent observation, because look at it from that's the reason why we have ISDS today, because before we had diplomatic protection, it's a similar problem. I mean, the question is whose rights are affected by the measure, and there is a debate on whether under diplomatic protection the rights that are damaged through the measure are belong to the person affected by it directly or to the state. So this is a question of who is a subject of international law. Now, this is why we have ISDS, but in both systems, ultimately, the primary victim of the measure is the taxpayer or the investor. So I think it's a very valid argument to say, but also what I find interesting is that now in the system, the taxpayer has the right to initiate the arbitration, if I understand correctly. So why, maybe it's a very bold question, and there is a simple answer to, but why giving the taxpayer reasonably the right to initiate arbitration? Because he has been affected by the measure, but not giving the taxpayer the right. I think the problem, the tax sovereignty concern could be the reason why tax authorities and policymakers are reluctant to give to go a step forwards like happens in ISDS. Probably they're afraid of the concerns that are being raised in ISDS. But I completely agree with and I have read your work too, and I mean, we have discussed this before. So I completely agree with you, Caterina, completely.
Thank you so much. Javier, I will just end here, but I think that this is also a topic that we can have in the dispute resolution seminar, the workshop on the 17th of June. And then we have now, next week, we will have the digital taxes and trading services, where we have David Bradbury from the OECD and some scholars and practitioners discussing about digital taxes. But please keep in mind that since we are recording this for the 17th of June, these problems will also be discussed. And even we have also Advocate General Cocotte, who will be presenting also on the topic of how they see it from the EU perspective. So I will hopefully see you all on the 10th of June from 2 to 5. It's 5 minutes over 5. I'm so sorry I took 5 minutes. Hopefully the discussion was interesting enough for you to stay these 5 minutes. And thank you to all the presenters and the speakers.